Good evening. Welcome. Tonight, we turn our attention to a house in the English countryside. A manor of stone and silence where, in the year 1665, a young man closed the shutters against a dying world and began a vigil that would illuminate human understanding for centuries, but would also demonstrate, with terrible clarity, what consciousness becomes when it refuses to rest, when it will not surrender to the oldest rhythm, when it believes that genius requires the sacrifice of sleep itself. Before we begin, take a moment to settle. Adjust your pillow. Let your body find that position where everything can finally release. And if you'd like to subscribe, please do, but only if these quiet hours together bring you some measure of peace. Only if this journey into the territories of sleeplessness somehow helps you find your own path toward rest. Now, let the day begin to fade, because tonight we explore a different kind of darkness. Not the gentle darkness of bedtime, not the restorative darkness where consciousness dissolves and renews, but the darkness that comes from refusing darkness entirely. The darkness of shuttered windows in daylight, the darkness of candles burning through all hours, the darkness of isolation so complete that time itself loses meaning, that day and night become indistinguishable, that the cycles governing all human life simply stop. Isaac Newton was 23 years old when the plague came to England. Cambridge University, where he studied, sent its scholars home to wait, to survive if they could, to return when death had finished its harvest, and the world was safe again for the gathering of minds, for the sharing of knowledge, for the communal pursuit of understanding that makes universities into more than buildings, into living networks of consciousness seeking truth together. But Newton did not wait, did not merely survive, did not use those plague years as intermission, as pause, as the break between chapters that fate seemed to be offering. Instead, he worked. It is said that in the stone rooms of Woolsthorpe Manor, in the house where he was born and to which he returned, Newton began the most productive period of intellectual achievement in recorded history. 2 years, perhaps slightly more, the chronology uncertain because Newton himself lost track of time in ways both literal and profound. 2 years that would yield calculus, that would reveal light's composite nature, that would uncover the laws of motion and gravity, that would lay foundations for physics that would stand for centuries, that would transform how humanity understands reality itself. 2 years of genius. 2 years of insights that seem almost impossible to have emerged from a single consciousness, from a single mind, in such compressed duration. But there was a cost. There is always a cost. And the price Newton paid was written in the practice that made those insights possible, that created the conditions under which such concentrated brilliance could emerge. He stopped sleeping. Not entirely, that would have killed him within days. Not in the dramatic, absolute way that the phrase suggests. But he reduced sleep to its barest minimum, to 2 or 3 hours stolen, when exhaustion became so overwhelming that consciousness could no longer be maintained through will alone. He eliminated the boundary between day and night, covered the windows so external time could not intrude, created in those manor rooms a kind of temporal void where work could continue endlessly, where questions could be pursued without interruption, where the mind could operate continuously in ways it was never designed to operate, in patterns that seemed sustainable briefly, but would extract their price slowly, across decades, in damage that would never fully heal. Beneath the silence of his calculations, beneath the brilliance of his discoveries, beneath the mathematical symbols that would reshape human knowledge, lived a simpler truth, that consciousness has requirements, that the body makes demands, that sleep is not optional, not weakness, not time wasted, though Newton believed all these things, but necessity so fundamental that refusing it means refusing the very architecture of being human, means crossing boundaries that should not be crossed, means learning through terrible experience what happens when we insist we can transcend limitation and discover instead that transcendence looks exactly like destruction. That the house where we lock ourselves away from time becomes the house where time exacts its revenge, slowly, invisibly, until one day we emerge and find we can never quite rejoin the rhythms we abandoned, can never quite sleep normally again, can never quite recover what was sacrificed to those years of relentless wakefulness. Some believe the plague years made Newton. That without that isolation, without those shuttered rooms, Without the elimination of all external structure and distraction, the insights would never have come. The breakthroughs would never have occurred. Calculus would have waited decades or centuries for someone else to discover it. That genius requires precisely this kind of extremity, this violation of normal human patterns, this willingness to sacrifice health and sanity and sustainable existence to the pursuit of understanding. But others look at the same evidence and see something different. See a young man damaged by circumstances beyond his control, responding to isolation and fear, and the collapse of the world he knew by throwing himself into work so completely that work became pathology, became the thing that saved him and destroyed him simultaneously, became the practice that would make him legendary and leave him permanently unable to rest, permanently displaced from the cycles that make human existence bearable across the decades of a lifetime. Where truth lives between these interpretations, we may never know. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps Newton's plague years represent both triumph and tragedy, both the heights of human achievement and a cautionary tale about the cost of such achievement, both proof of consciousness's extraordinary capacity and evidence of its profound fragility when pushed beyond the limits that evolution designed it to respect. Tonight, we invite you to explore those plague years with us. To enter, imaginatively, the shuttered rooms where a young man worked without rest, while the world outside struggled with death and grief. To witness, through 12 meditative chapters, what happened when time stopped following ordinary rules, when day and night merged into continuous duration, when sleep became not nightly practice but occasional surrender, when consciousness insisted it could operate indefinitely and learned, slowly, what infinite operation actually costs. We will walk through Woolsthorpe Manor as it was in those years, silent, isolated, sealed against the world, filled with candlelight and calculations, and the presence of a mind working at intensities that should not be sustainable. We will examine the mathematics that emerged, yes, but more importantly, we will contemplate the mathematician, the flesh that carried those insights, the body that paid the price, the consciousness that achieved so much and lost so much in the achieving that even centuries later we cannot say with certainty whether the trade was worth it, whether the insights justified the suffering, whether we should celebrate Newton's sacrifice or mourn it. This is not a story with clear heroes or villains, not a tale of triumph alone or tragedy alone, but something more complex, more human, more troubling. The story of what happens when isolation extends too long, when work consumes too completely, when the practices that seem necessary for genius prove to be the practices that destroy the capacity for ordinary human existence, for rest, for the simple rhythm of waking and sleeping that Newton abandoned during the plague years and never fully recovered, carrying the cost forward through his entire life. Through decades of disordered sleep and strange hours, and the sense reported by all who knew him that he existed somehow apart, somehow displaced, somehow never quite synchronized with the temporal flow that governed other lives. As you settle now into your own rest, as you prepare for the journey into sleep that Newton denied himself, consider this, that the darkness you're entering is a gift, that the dissolution of consciousness you'll experience tonight is not loss but renewal, that the cycles you honor by closing your eyes and allowing sleep to come are not weakness but profound wisdom, not limitation, but the very thing that makes human consciousness sustainable, that allows us to wake tomorrow refreshed rather than accumulating exhaustion across days and weeks and years until the burden becomes unbearable. So breathe deeply. Let your body grow heavy. Allow the day's weight to begin its slow release. And as Newton once stood in his shuttered manor refusing the darkness, refusing the rest, refusing the ancient wisdom that says consciousness must periodically cease, you can make a different choice. You can surrender. You can accept what he would not accept. You can honor what he violated. The story waits. 12 chapters. 12 meditations on sleeplessness, on genius, on isolation, on the price of understanding purchased through practices that should never be sustained as long as Newton sustained them. But the chapters will unfold slowly, gently, at the pace of breath deepening, of thoughts beginning to drift, of consciousness releasing its grip on the waking world. Newton stood vigil while the world slept, but you do not have to stand. You can lie down, can close your eyes, can accept the invitation he refused to rest, to dissolve, to trust the darkness that he feared, that he walled himself against, that he spent 2 years avoiding and the rest of his life unable to fully embrace because those 2 years had damaged something fundamental, had broken the machinery of rest so thoroughly that even when he wanted to sleep, and he did want to, desperately, in his later years sleep would not come as it should, would not restore as it must, would only remind him of what he had sacrificed in those plague years, when the house stood outside time, and the young man inside it believed he was conquering the universe, but was actually learning the hardest lesson. That some victories are indistinguishable from defeats, that some achievements cost more than they're worth, that consciousness pushed past its limits doesn't transcend, but breaks, slowly, invisibly, until one day you realize you can never quite rest again, can never quite sleep normally, can never quite recover what was lost to those years of relentless wakefulness. Let us begin, not by refusing rest as Newton did, but by honoring it, by descending into the very darkness he denied himself, by learning, through his story, why sleep matters, why the cycles we're tempted to violate are actually protecting us, why the house that stands outside time becomes a prison, not a palace, why the vigil that seems necessary for genius proves to be the thing that destroys the capacity for the very insights it seeks to produce. Good night, sweet rest. And gratitude to Newton, who showed us through his brilliance and his suffering both that consciousness has limits we ignore at our peril, that the body's wisdom exceeds the mind's ambition, that the plague years which gave the world calculus also took from one young man the ability to sleep normally ever again, proving that some prices are too high, some sacrifices too complete, some vigils too long to survive intact. Close your eyes now. The manor awaits. The shuttered windows. The endless candlelight. The young man who would not sleep and the rest he never recovered. But you can sleep. You can rest. You can honor what he violated and find in that honoring the peace he sought through mathematics but never achieved, the restoration he needed but never accepted, the mercy that waits for all of us in the darkness if only we're willing, as Newton was not, to close our eyes and trust that when we wake, we'll be renewed rather than depleted, restored rather than exhausted, human rather than the thing Newton became. Brilliant, yes, but also broken, carrying insights that changed civilization while carrying also the permanent cost of the house that time forgot, the manor where sleep was refused, the plague years that demonstrated with perfect clarity that genius and self-destruction can be one thing, that the practices which seem to elevate us are often the practices that unmake us, that the darkness we fear is actually the darkness that saves us from ourselves, from our ambitions, from the relentless drive to understand that can consume everything, including the consciousness doing the understanding, leaving only the equations, only the discoveries, only the legacy, while the man who made them spends his remaining decades unable to rest properly, unable to sleep deeply, unable to recover what was lost to those 2 years when time stopped and work continued, and a young man proved that yes. You can achieve the impossible, but the impossible achievement comes with a price that must be paid in full, in decades of disordered rest, in a lifetime of displacement from the rhythms that make life bearable, in the final recognition that what was gained during the plague years could never compensate for what was lost. The simple, sacred ability to close one's eyes and sleep. Rest now. The story continues in darkness, and the darkness, this time, is kind. Chapter 1. The house that time forgot it is said that there exists, in the green fields of Lincolnshire, where the land rolls gentle toward horizons empty of all human presence, a manor house that once held time itself captive. Not through magic, not through any enchantment except the kind that consciousness weaves when it refuses to surrender, when it will not bow to the ancient rhythm that governs all living things. Woolsthorpe Manor stands still today, its stone walls weathered by centuries, its windows catching the same light they caught in 1665 when a young man of 23 arrived at its threshold, sent home from Cambridge, sent away from learning and library, and the company of other minds, sent into isolation that was not choice but commandment for the plague had come, had emptied villages, had silenced church bells, had transformed England into a landscape of locked doors and distant smoke, and the terrible knowledge that death moved invisibly among the living, selecting its harvest according to logic no one could predict or prevent. Isaac Newton crossed that threshold in summer. The fields beyond the manor rolled green and gold beneath a sun that seemed too beautiful, too innocent for a world where sickness moved like wind, touching some and passing others, leaving grief in patterns that defied all reason. He carried with him books, papers, the tools of thought and calculation. He carried questions that had no answers yet, problems that had defeated greater minds than his, curiosities about light and motion, and the forces that governed falling things, that kept planets in their courses, that made the universe operate by laws he suspected existed, but could not yet name, could not yet capture in the language of mathematics that he was only beginning to understand was insufficient, was missing something, required new symbols, new methods. New ways of thinking that did not exist yet, but that he would have to invent if he wanted to proceed. He closed the shutters. This detail matters, though it seems small. Not all of them, not at first. But enough to signal his intention, enough to mark the beginning of a transformation that would occur not in days, but across seasons, across years, in the stone rooms where time would stop following ordinary rules and begin following his rules instead. Or perhaps following no rules at all except the relentless accumulation of hours without punctuation, without the natural divisions that make human existence bearable, sustainable, something other than continuous duration. Beneath the silence of those first weeks, as summer turned toward autumn and the world outside continued its dance of life and death, of plague spreading and receding in patterns that seemed almost tidal, Newton began to work. Not as students work, with schedules and structure and the external rhythms imposed by bells and lectures and the movement of other bodies through shared space. But as something else works, as obsession works, as compulsion, as the thing that has no name except the hunger to understand, to know, to see what others have not seen, to penetrate mysteries that have waited since before humans learned to wonder about them. The days bled into nights. This is not metaphor. This is description of what actually occurred when shutters remained closed, when candles burned through all hours, when the rising sun meant nothing because its light could not penetrate the barriers Newton had erected between himself and the world's cycles. Morning arrived for the farmers in distant fields, for the scattered survivors in villages the plague had touched and left diminished. But morning did not arrive at Woolsthorpe, only continuation. Only the work that had been happening before dawn and would happen after, without pause, without acknowledgement that one day had ended and another begun, without the clean break that allows consciousness to organize time into units, into chapters, into the story we tell ourselves about progression from past through present toward future. Some believe that genius requires this kind of violation. That the insights Newton achieved during those plague years, the mathematics that would become calculus, the understanding of light's nature, the laws of motion and gravity that would reshape human comprehension of the cosmos, required precisely this elimination of normal rhythms, this refusal of rest, this descent into timelessness where the mind could pursue questions without interruption, without the constant starting and stopping that structured time imposes. Without the nightly reset that sleep provides, and that Newton increasingly denied himself, ignored, treated as obstacle rather than necessity, as weakness rather than wisdom. His body made demands. Of course it did. The flesh that carried his consciousness had requirements written into every cell, inherited from ancestors who survived because they honored the cycles of waking and sleeping, of activity and rest, of the daily death and resurrection that makes sustained consciousness possible across decades. But Newton treated these demands as suggestions, as interruptions to be minimized, as evidence that the body was imperfect instrument, unreliable vessel for the mind that occupied it, prone to needs that interfered with the real work of thinking, calculating, pursuing understanding that seemed more urgent, more essential than any physical requirement could ever be. Where memory fades into the fragmentary evidence of notebooks and scattered accounts, we find traces of what those plague years contained. Pages covered in calculations, experiments conducted in shuttered rooms. The gradual transformation of a young man who arrived at the manor, still synchronized with the world's rhythms into something else, something that had learned to operate outside time, or believed it had, or had damaged its own capacity to perceive time normally and mistook the damage for transcendence. The work consumed him, not gradually, not as work normally consumes the dedicated scholar. but with a hunger that was alive. That was itself a presence in those stone rooms, that demanded everything and offered in return only the possibility of insights that might justify the sacrifice, that might make the cost worth paying, though the cost would not be fully visible for years, for decades, would only reveal itself slowly as the patterns established during the plague years carved themselves too deep to escape, became permanent features of consciousness that could never quite return to normal rhythms, that would remain forever slightly displaced from the cycles that governed other lives. Days disappeared into nights that disappeared into days. The sun rose and set beyond the shuttered windows, marking time that Newton no longer measured, no longer acknowledged, no longer participated in except as obstacle to continuous work, as interference that could be eliminated through sufficient determination, through curtains thick enough to block all external light, through will that insisted consciousness could operate indefinitely if only the distractions were removed, if only the world would disappear and leave him alone with the questions that mattered. With the pursuit that justified everything, that made isolation seem not curse but gift, not punishment but the precise condition required for genius to emerge. And genius did emerge. This cannot be denied. The mathematics that would become calculus, the optical experiments that revealed light's composite nature, the calculations about gravity that would eventually demonstrate the same force pulled apples earthward and held moons in their celestial dance. All of this arose during the plague years, during the isolation, during the time when Newton existed outside normal temporal flow, when he worked without rest, when he pushed consciousness past limits that should not be sustainable, that would prove not to be sustainable, but that yielded before they exacted their full-price insights that would illuminate human understanding for centuries. But what was lost? This question hangs in the silence of those shuttered rooms, echoes through the centuries that separate us from that young man working by candlelight, while the world outside struggled with plague, with death, with the collective grief of villages emptied and families destroyed. What was lost when time stopped following ordinary rules? What capacity for normal rest was sacrificed? What relationship with the rhythms that bind humans into communities, into shared experience, into the dance of day and night that makes existence something other than continuous work interrupted only by exhaustion, marked by the moon that rose and set beyond windows he would not open, marked by seasons changing in ways he did not witness, marked by time that continued its patient accumulation whether or not any consciousness attended to its passage? Newton's vigil extended. 1 year, 2 years. The plague would eventually subside. Cambridge would reopen. He would return to the world. But what returned would not be quite what had departed. The young scholar who closed those shutters in 1665 and the man who eventually opened them again were not the same being. Time had not stopped despite his efforts. It had continued its work. And the work it had done was written in patterns that would never fully heal, in rhythms that would never fully restore themselves, in the permanent cost of those years when the house stood outside time, or believed it did, or succeeded so completely in eliminating external reference that internal time became unmoored, became something else, became the formless duration that Newton inhabited while the rest of the world continued its ancient dance. While life and death and day and night proceeded according to laws older and wiser than any mathematics, laws that Newton had tried to transcend and learned, though perhaps never fully acknowledged, cannot be transcended, only violated, only ignored at a price that becomes clear only later, only after the patterns are established too deeply to break. Only after the house that held time captive releases its occupant back into a world that continued without him, and finds that what it released is no longer quite capable of synchronizing, of finding the rhythm again, of living in time the way others do, the way he once did, before the plague, before the isolation, before the vigil that would make him legendary and damage him permanently. That would give the world calculus and gravity and optics, but take from Newton himself something that can never be recovered, never be restored, never be anything except the permanent echo of those years when time forgot the house, or the house forgot time, or both forgot each other in rooms where shutters remained closed, and candles burned through all hours, and a young man worked without rest, without pause, without mercy for the body that carried his genius or recognition that some sacrifices, once made. mark us forever. Perhaps it was never meant to be opened again, that door between ordinary time and the timelessness Newton discovered. Perhaps what he found in those plague years was not meant to be found, was territory that should remain unexplored, was understanding purchased at a price too high. Though the world that benefited from his discoveries would never calculate that cost, would never weigh his suffering against the insights, would only celebrate the genius and forget the vigil, the isolation, the years when the house stood outside time, and the young man inside it learned what consciousness becomes when it will not rest. When it refuses the ancient rhythms, when it believes it can work continuously, and discovers too late that continuous work is also continuous erosion, continuous damage, continuous loss of something that once lost cannot be recovered, the ability to sleep normally, to rest deeply, to return each night to the darkness where all humans were meant to go, where Newton would struggle to go for the remainder of his life, carrying always the mark of those plague years when time stopped in Woolsthorpe Manor. Or seemed to stop, or moved so differently from the world's time that when he finally emerged, he found himself permanently displaced, permanently unable to quite rejoin the rhythm he had abandoned. The house having taught him how to exist outside time, but never how to return, never how to find his way back to the cycles he had refused, leaving him stranded between worlds, between the timeless pursuit of understanding and the time-bound existence of being human, belonging fully to neither. Carrying always the cost of the house that time forgot, or that forgot time, or that simply stood as witness to what happens when isolation extends too long, when work consumes too completely, when consciousness refuses rest until rest becomes impossible, and all that remains is the eternal present of the vigil that can never truly end, that continues even after death, echoing through centuries in the equations he left behind, in the manner that still stands. In the shuttered windows that once blocked time's passage and now let it flow again, as it always flowed, as it never stopped flowing, patient and eternal, waiting for all of us to remember what Newton forgot, that we are not meant to exist outside it, that the rhythms we refuse will claim us anyway, that the house will not protect us from time's passage, but only delay our recognition of what time is doing, what it has always done. What it did to Newton in those plague years when he thought he was mastering the universe, but was actually learning the oldest lesson. That time cannot be stopped, only denied, and denial changes nothing except ourselves, makes us into ghosts haunting a present that continues flowing toward a future where all vigils end, all work ceases, all consciousness finds at last the rest it needed all along, the darkness it feared, the silence where even genius must finally surrender. There was a room in Woolsthorpe Manor that never knew daylight during those plague years. Not because it lacked windows, though Newton had covered them with such thoroughness that not a single ray of external illumination could penetrate, that even the most determined sunbeam was turned away, left to illuminate the fields beyond while the chamber remained in darkness absolute, but because what happened in that space required night eternal, required the elimination of every reference point, except the ones Newton himself created through candle flame and prism. Through the apparatus he built to split white light into its hidden spectrum, to understand what color truly was, to see what no one had seen before because no one had been desperate enough, sleepless enough, isolated enough to pursue the question with such relentless, unforgiving focus. It is said that Newton would spend entire days, though day had no meaning in that perpetual midnight, though the concept itself became abstract when divorced from the rising and setting of the sun, experimenting with light. He had drilled a hole in one shutter, small as a pinprick, allowing a single beam to enter the chamber's darkness. This beam, white as it appeared to common observation, was not white at all. Newton knew this, suspected this, had read the fragmentary accounts of others who had noticed that glass bends different colors differently, that lenses produce rainbows at their edges, that light carries secrets beneath its surface simplicity. But knowing and proving are different territories. And proof required darkness, required isolation from all other light sources, required the kind of sustained observation that only sleeplessness permits, when consciousness remains alert through hours that others spend unconscious, when the experimenter can watch transformations that occur too slowly for anyone operating on normal rhythms to witness completely, when the boundary between observer and observed grows uncertain, because exhaustion has thinned the walls that normally separate self from world. In that chamber of perpetual midnight, Newton existed in a state between waking and some other territory that has no name. Not quite delirium, his notes remained precise, his observations accurate, his conclusions sound. But not quite ordinary consciousness either. Something altered. Something that had learned to perceive differently, to attend with intensity impossible for the well-rested, to pursue single questions through spans of time that should fragment attention, but instead focused it to a point so sharp it seemed to pierce through appearance into the reality beneath. Beneath the silence of that shuttered room, beneath the hum of his own breathing and the occasional scratch of pen on paper, Newton discovered that white light was composite, was mixture. Was 7 colors red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet traveling together, masquerading as simplicity, revealing their true nature only when passed through the prism, only when separated by the slight differences in how glass bends each wavelength, only when someone cared enough to look carefully, to eliminate all confounding factors, to work in darkness so complete that the single beam of controlled light could tell its secrets without interference. He would stare at this spectrum for hours. The notebooks record this, though they cannot record the state of consciousness that allowed such staring, that made it possible to attend to subtle variations in color boundaries, to notice which hues blended and which remained distinct, to perceive patterns that required sustained focus far beyond what normal human attention can maintain. But Newton's attention was no longer normal. Had been transformed by the isolation, by the sleeplessness, by the weeks and months of existing in this chamber, where midnight was eternal, and the only rhythms were the rhythms he imposed, where time was measured not by the sun's passage, but by candles burning down, by experiments completed, by insights achieved or remaining tantalizingly out of reach. Some believe the optical work was respite from his mathematical labors, from the mental strain of inventing calculus, from the abstract demands of wrestling with infinitesimals and rates of change. But the chamber of perpetual midnight suggests otherwise. Suggests that all of Newton's work during the plague years was continuous, was one long descent into territories where normal human consciousness cannot follow, where the practices required for insight became indistinguishable from the practices that signal breakdown, where brilliance and damage arose from the same source and could not be separated. Where memory fades into the uncertain accounts of those who visited the manor after the plague years ended, we find descriptions that trouble even centuries later. The shutters would remain closed. The room where Newton conducted his optical experiments would still be darkened, even when visitors came, even when he tried to demonstrate his discoveries to others, as though he could no longer tolerate full daylight. As though his eyes, adapted to the perpetual midnight, had lost their capacity to function in normal illumination. As though the darkness had become necessary, had become the only environment where his consciousness could operate, had become prison rather than laboratory, but a prison he could not leave because leaving would mean abandoning the work, abandoning the pursuit, acknowledging that the methods had become unsustainable. He did experiments that should not be attempted. This is documented, though the documentation itself is disturbing. He would stare directly at the sun's reflection in a mirror, would look until his vision filled with afterimages so strong he could not see normally for days, would press metal against his eyeball to observe the colored rings that pressure produced, would risk permanent blindness in pursuit of understanding how vision works, how light interacts with the eye, how perception itself operates. Not from carelessness, not from recklessness, but from the same obsessive focus that characterized all his plague year work, the same willingness to sacrifice anything comfort, health, sanity, the body's integrity to the questions that consumed him. What do we see when all external light is eliminated? When darkness is so complete that the faintest illumination becomes visible, becomes significant, becomes the total content of perception. Newton spent months in such darkness, punctuated only by his controlled experiments, by the single beam splitting into spectrum, by candlelight so dim it barely registered. And in that darkness, consciousness transforms, adapts, begins to perceive things invisible in ordinary light, begins to generate its own images when no external images arrive, begins to blur the boundary between what is observed and what is imagined, between perception and hallucination, between the insights that come from careful observation and the visions that come from a mind stretched too thin, maintained awake too long, isolated too completely from the rhythms that normally anchor consciousness to reality. Did Newton see things in that chamber that were not there? Did the darkness, combined with exhaustion and isolation, produce experiences that went beyond optical phenomena into territories more mysterious, more troubling? The notebooks suggest possibilities without confirming them. Mentions of strange lights that appeared when no source existed. Descriptions of colors that have no names, that exist only at the edges of perception or beyond perception entirely, that he glimpsed briefly before they vanished, leaving him uncertain whether they were discoveries or symptoms, whether he was perceiving new aspects of reality, or whether reality was beginning to fragment under the sustained assault of consciousness that would not rest. Marked by the weeks that became months, marked by the accumulation of observations that would eventually revolutionize optics, but that came at a cost written in his deteriorating handwriting, in the increasingly disordered quality of his notes, in the sense that emerges from the documentary record that something was happening in that chamber beyond science, beyond experiment, beyond the rational pursuit of understanding something that had to do with consciousness itself. With what happens when it operates too long in darkness, when it refuses the light-dark cycle that evolution designed it to follow, when it insists on perpetual midnight because perpetual midnight serves the work, serves the pursuit, serves the questions that matter more than health, more than sanity, more than the capacity to ever again perceive light normally, to ever again see colors the way others see them. To ever again trust that what appears in vision actually exists externally rather than being generated by a perceptual system damaged by months of darkness and the relentless demands Newton placed upon it. The spectrum that emerged from his prism was beautiful. This cannot be denied. The 7 colors separating cleanly, each occupying its proper place, the whole demonstrating that complexity hides beneath apparent simplicity. That patient observation reveals truths invisible to casual looking, that the universe operates according to laws we can discover if we're willing to look carefully enough, to eliminate confounding factors, to work in darkness so complete that the signal we seek stands out against the background, clear and undeniable. But the beauty came with shadows. With the damage done to eyes that stared too long at light too bright, with the consciousness that adapted to perpetual midnight and could never quite readapt to normal day. With the pattern established of sacrificing the body to the mind's demands, of treating physical limits as obstacles to overcome rather than wisdom to heed, of believing that understanding justifies any cost, any suffering, any violation of the body's requirements, a pattern that would persist long after the plague years ended, long after the chamber was reopened to daylight, long after Newton returned to the world, and discovered that the world's light had become somehow harsh, somehow intolerable, somehow wrong compared to the controlled darkness where he had spent months learning to see differently, learning to perceive what others missed, learning also, though perhaps he never fully acknowledged this, to distrust his own perception, to question whether what he saw was real or merely the product of exhaustion and isolation, and the strange states of consciousness that arise when darkness extends too long, when midnight becomes not a time but a permanent condition. When the chamber that was meant to reveal light's secrets instead revealed the secrets of what happens to consciousness when it abandons the rhythms of light and dark, day and night, waking and sleeping, and tries to operate in perpetual darkness that was meant to be temporary but became, like so much of the plague years, permanent, irreversible, the mark of those months when Newton pursued understanding in a chamber of perpetual midnight, and found understanding, yes, but also found darkness of a different kind, the kind that lives inside, that cannot be escaped by opening shutters or lighting candles, that persists long after the external darkness ends, that follows him through the remaining decades of his life, reminding him always that some prices once paid cannot be refunded, some damage once done cannot be undone, some chambers once entered do not release their occupants unchanged, but mark them forever with the cost of what was learned there. What was seen there, what was sacrificed to the perpetual midnight where light revealed its secrets and consciousness revealed its fragility, and the boundary between discovery and damage dissolved completely, leaving only the spectrum, beautiful and terrible both, and the question that can never be fully answered. Was it worth it? Was any insight worth months of darkness? Was understanding light worth losing the capacity to see it normally ever again? The chamber cannot answer. Can only stand in silence, shutters long since opened, daylight long since returned, bearing witness to what occurred there when midnight was eternal, and a young man believed that darkness was tool rather than danger, that isolation from light cycles would yield insights rather than extract costs, that the chamber where he pursued optical understanding would be laboratory rather than the prison it became, the trap it remains. The warning it offers across centuries to anyone tempted to believe that consciousness can operate outside its natural cycles without consequence, that darkness can be sustained indefinitely without damage, that the chamber of perpetual midnight is doorway to understanding rather than what it truly is. The place where understanding and madness share the same address, where insight and symptoms speak the same language, where the light that Newton split into spectrum illuminated truths about the external world while casting shadows across his internal world that would never fully lift, that would follow him always. The cost of those months when midnight was choice, and then became compulsion, and finally became the only state where consciousness could function, where perception made sense, where the work could continue until the day when work ended, and shutters opened, and Newton emerged from perpetual midnight into a world too bright, too harsh, too utterly different from the darkness he had inhabited for so long that readaptation proved impossible, and he carried the chamber with him always, carried its darkness, carried its isolation, carried the permanent mark of those plague-year months when he learned to see in ways no one had seen before and lost, perhaps forever. The simple ability to see normally, to perceive light as blessing rather than assault, to trust that what appears in vision corresponds to external reality, rather than being product of perceptual systems damaged beyond recovery by the relentless demands of genius operating in darkness absolute, in midnight perpetual. In the chamber where time stopped, and light revealed its secrets and consciousness, paid the price that chambers like this always exact from those who enter them believing that understanding is worth any cost, and learn too late that some costs are simply too high, some chambers too dark, some midnights too permanent to survive intact. It is said that calculus appeared in Newton's notebooks like something channeled rather than calculated, not built step by careful step from established principles, not derived through the patient progression of logical deduction, but arriving whole, complete, as though the mathematics had always existed somewhere beyond human reach, and Newton, in his sleepless vigil, had simply become receptive enough to perceive it, to transcribe it, to serve as vessel for knowledge that flowed through him rather than from him. The pages fill with symbols that have no names yet. With notation, he is inventing even as he uses it, creating the language he needs to express ideas that existing mathematics cannot capture. The derivative, the integral, the relationship between them that he calls the fundamental theorem, that demonstrates how operations that seem opposite are actually two faces of the same underlying reality. Methods for calculating instantaneous rates of change, for finding areas beneath curves, for solving problems that had defeated mathematicians for centuries. It comes too quickly. This is what troubles those who examine his plague-year notebooks centuries later. The progression from problem to solution occurs across pages rather than years, across days rather than months. As though sleeplessness had accelerated thought, had compressed time in ways that mirror his mathematics, as though by refusing the nightly interruption of sleep, Newton had achieved a kind of continuity that allowed insights to build upon each other without the forgetting that normally occurs, without the reset that ordinarily fragments extended reasoning into manageable pieces. But was this advantage or symptom? This is the question that cannot be answered with certainty, that remains suspended in the same ambiguity that characterizes so much of the plague years. Modern mathematics textbooks present calculus as though it emerged smoothly, rationally, through pure logical progression. But Newton's notebooks tell a different story. Tell of false starts and sudden breakthroughs, of pages covered with calculations that lead nowhere, followed by pages where everything suddenly works, where the symbols align and the methods cohere, and understanding arrives not as conclusion of careful reasoning, but as revelation, as gift from unknown sources, as the fruit of consciousness operating in states that ordinary mathematicians never access because ordinary mathematicians sleep. Beneath the silence of those shuttered rooms, in the hours past midnight when exhaustion normally claims even the most dedicated scholar, Newton would sit with his pen and paper and pursue questions about motion, about curves, about the mathematics of continuous change. How fast is something moving at a single instant? The question seems simple, but hides impossible complexity. An instant has no duration. Without duration, there is no change. Without change, there is no motion. Yet things move continuously, passing through every point of their trajectory, occupying each location for literally zero time. How do you calculate the speed of something at a moment when the very concept of speed distance divided by time, requires duration, requires something that the instant cannot provide? Newton's answer was the infinitesimal, the number that is almost zero but not quite, the quantity smaller than any you can name yet somehow not equal to nothing. This concept makes no sense to ordinary logic, violates basic principles of mathematics that Newton himself had been taught. Yet it works, allows calculations that produce correct answers, that predict planetary motion with uncanny accuracy, that solve engineering problems that had resisted all previous attempts. The mathematics that should be impossible proves to be the most powerful tool ever developed for describing reality. Some believe this could only have emerged from consciousness, operating beyond its normal parameters. That the infinitesimal simultaneously zero and net zero, vanishing and yet significant, could only be conceived by a mind that had itself become infinitesimal in some sense, that had learned through sleeplessness to exist in states between being and not being, between waking and sleeping, between ordinary awareness and whatever strange territory Newton inhabited during the plague years. Where memory fades into speculation, where documentation becomes so sparse that interpretation fills the gaps, we can only wonder, what was Newton's state of consciousness when he developed these methods? His handwriting in the notebooks varies wildly, sometimes precise and controlled, sometimes sprawling across pages, as though the hand could barely keep pace with thoughts racing faster than physical writing allows. Some pages are dated. Others have no temporal reference at all, as though he had lost track entirely of what day it was, what month, what season. Some calculations are checked and verified. Others simply end mid-derivation, as though exhaustion finally overcame him, as though consciousness that had been sustained through superhuman effort finally collapsed, and he woke hours later, or was it days? Unable to remember what he had been pursuing, what insight had been approaching, what understanding had been just within reach before darkness claimed him. But then there are the pages that are perfect, where the mathematics flows without error, where complex derivations extend across multiple sheets with perfect consistency, where every step follows inevitably from what came before and leads inevitably to what comes after. These pages suggest consciousness operating at levels far beyond Newton's normal capacity, far beyond what should be sustainable. They suggest the work not of a tired scholar struggling to understand, but of something else, something that had transcended ordinary limits, that had accessed territories of understanding normally closed to human consciousness, that had found through sleeplessness a doorway into mathematical truths that wait somewhere beyond the threshold of ordinary awareness. Did the mathematics write themselves? This is not mysticism, but description of what the experience might have felt like, the sense that Newton reports in fragmentary comments, the feeling that he was discovering rather than inventing, that the calculus existed already, and he was merely the first to perceive it, to recognize patterns that had always been present but invisible until consciousness learned to look in the right way, from the right angle, with the intensity that only exhaustion permits. Marked by the months of isolation, marked by the accumulation of pages covered in symbols that would eventually transform human understanding of motion, of change, of the mathematical structure underlying physical reality, Newton's relationship with his own work grew strange. He would refer to insights as things that came to him rather than things he achieved. Would describe breakthroughs as arriving in moments between waking and sleep, though those moments, during the plague years, extended for hours because the boundary between states had become so blurred, because consciousness operated in territories that were neither one nor the other but somehow both simultaneously, just as his infinitesimals were neither zero nor net zero, but somehow both simultaneously. The notebooks reveal a pattern, bursts of intense productivity followed by gaps. Days where dozens of pages fill with calculations followed by days where nothing is recorded. This might suggest ordinary work rhythms, periods of focus followed by periods of rest. But the gaps are wrong. Too long to be sleep, too short to be abandonment of the problem, more like collapses. More like the inevitable consequences of pushing consciousness beyond sustainable limits until the system simply shuts down, overrides will with biological necessity, forces rest not as voluntary choice, but as involuntary cessation, as the body's last defense against a mind that has forgotten how to stop, that has lost the ability to moderate its own intensity, that works until it cannot work, and then works more until finally something fundamental gives way and consciousness simply ceases. And then he would wake hours later, days later, time having passed in ways he could not account for, and return to the mathematics as though no interruption had occurred. As though the collapse was simply transition between one state of work and another, as though even unconsciousness was merely a different mode of mathematical thinking, a processing that occurred below awareness and emerged when consciousness returned, ready to continue. Carrying forward the threads of calculation that should have been lost, but somehow persisted, somehow remained accessible, somehow allowed the work to proceed despite interruptions that should have fragmented it beyond recovery. Perhaps this is what genius requires, not merely talent or dedication or even obsessive focus, but the willingness to operate in states that normal consciousness avoids, that healthy minds recognize as dangerous and refuse to enter, that Newton entered because isolation and plague, and the particular configuration of his mind, and the practices he developed all conspired to create conditions where entry became possible. Where the mathematics that wrote themselves could find a consciousness receptive enough to receive them, damaged enough to access territories that health would not permit, exhausted enough that the normal barriers between self and understanding had worn so thin that truths could pass through, could make themselves known to a mind that had prepared itself through months of sleeplessness to receive knowledge that arrives only when consciousness no longer operates normally, when the receiver is no longer quite sane. When genius and breakdown speak the same language and produce the same symbols, and can be distinguished only by whether the results work, whether the mathematics predicts reality accurately, whether the insights that seemed like visions prove to correspond to something external or reveal themselves as purely internal phantoms generated by a mind so exhausted it could no longer distinguish between discovery and delusion. The mathematics worked. This is the final arbiter. The calculus that emerged from Newton's plague-year notebooks proved functional, proved powerful, proved to be exactly the tool that physics needed that would unlock centuries of scientific progress. So we call it genius, call it discovery, call it one of history's great intellectual achievements, and we are not wrong to do so. The mathematics was real. The insights were valid. The contribution was immense. But was there another way? Could calculus have been developed without the sleeplessness, without the isolation, without the violation of every healthy boundary that characterized Newton's plague years? We will never know. Can only observe that this is how it happened, that the mathematics that wrote themselves required a consciousness so damaged, so displaced from normal functioning, so exhausted that it could no longer tell whether it was discovering truths about the universe or generating coherent hallucinations. And that this ambiguity, this terrible, beautiful ambiguity, is perhaps the essential condition for the kind of insight that transforms human understanding. That the mathematics that seemed to write themselves required a hand so tired it could barely hold the pen, a mind so stretched it had lost normal shape, a consciousness so far beyond ordinary limits that it had entered territory where the impossible becomes thinkable, and the thinkable becomes the foundation of a new mathematics, a new physics. A new understanding that would illuminate the world even as it left its creator permanently marked by the cost of accessing knowledge that perhaps was never meant to be found this way, through these methods, at this price. But that arrived anyway, wrote itself anyway, used Newton as vessel anyway, and left behind not only the calculus that changed civilization, but also the question that can never be answered. Did the mathematics write themselves, or did Newton's exhausted consciousness generate them? And does the distinction matter when the results work, when the predictions match reality, when the tools prove powerful beyond anything previous mathematics could achieve? Perhaps not. Perhaps the only thing that matters is that they exist, that we have them, that calculus serves us even if we can never fully know whether it was discovered or invented, channeled or created, gift from mathematical reality or artifact of consciousness, stretched beyond human limits, until it began perceiving things that may or may not have been there, but that, real or imagined, transformed everything, justified everything, made even the terrible cost seem, if not worthwhile, at least comprehensible as the price that had to be paid for knowledge this profound, this powerful, this essential even if paying it meant sacrificing the simple human capacity to sleep, to rest, to operate within normal bounds, to be anything except the vessel through which mathematics wrote themselves during those plague years when a young man sat alone in a shuttered manor, and became, for a brief time, the portal through which truths passed from wherever they exist into the world that needed them, that would use them, that would celebrate them without ever fully counting the cost that Newton paid to make them available, to serve as the hand that wrote what the mathematics themselves seemed to demand be written, to be the consciousness that sacrificed itself so that understanding could emerge, so that calculus could exist, so that the impossible could be made merely difficult, and the difficult could be made routine, and all of it could flow from those plague year pages where symbols appeared like revelations. And a young man wrote until his hand cramped, and his vision blurred and consciousness itself began to fragment, but wrote anyway, kept writing, would not stop writing, could not stop until the mathematics had written themselves completely, and Newton could finally, mercifully, rest. Due to length constraints, I'll continue with the remaining chapters. Would you like me to continue with chapters 412? An apple falls. This is the myth, the story everyone knows, the moment of revelation that seems too simple, too perfectly symbolic, too convenient to be true. And perhaps it is myth Newton himself offered conflicting accounts in his later years, sometimes confirming the story, sometimes remaining silent, sometimes suggesting the truth was more complex, more extended, less dramatic than a single fruit dropping from a tree and unlocking in an instant the secrets of gravity. But something did fall during those plague years. Not just an apple, not just a single moment, but Newton's entire understanding of the cosmos, the careful distinctions he had maintained between earthly and celestial, between the physics that governed falling objects and the physics that governed planetary motion. These distinctions fell away during the sleepless months at Woolsthorpe, collapsed under the weight of questions he could not stop pursuing, calculations he could not abandon, the relentless drive to understand why things fall at all, what force pulls them earthward, whether that force has limits or extends infinitely into space, touching moon and planets with the same invisible hand that draws apples from branches. It is said that the question consumed him. Not gradually, not as intellectual curiosity that could be pursued when convenient and set aside when other matters demanded attention, but with the totality that characterizes obsession, that marks the territory where healthy interest becomes compulsion, where the pursuit of understanding becomes the only thing that matters, that justifies the sacrifice of sleep and health and sanity because the question will not release its hold, will not allow consciousness to rest until answers emerge or consciousness breaks entirely under the relentless pressure of not knowing. He calculated the moon's orbit, over and over, using different methods, different approaches, checking and rechecking because the answer mattered more than anything had ever mattered. Because if the moon fell like the apple, if the same force governed both, if the cosmos operated by unified principles rather than separate rules for heaven and earth, then everything changed, everything unified, everything became comprehensible through mathematics that could describe falling fruit and orbiting satellites with the same equations, the same elegant simplicity. But the calculations required his new mathematics, required the methods he was inventing even as he used them, the calculus that allowed him to determine instantaneous rates of change, to calculate forces that varied with distance, to handle the complex geometry of orbital motion. The work fed itself needed calculus to understand gravity, needed gravity to motivate the development of calculus and Newton, stood at the center of this recursive loop, unable to stop, unable to rest, because each insight demanded the next, and the next demanded the previous, and everything intertwined, until separating work from exhaustion became impossible, until the pursuit of understanding became indistinguishable from the thing destroying his capacity to understand. Beneath the silence of those plague year nights, beneath the scratch of pen on paper and the occasional crackle of candle flame, Newton held impossibly complex calculations in his mind simultaneously. Not written out fully paper was precious, and besides, much of the work happened internally, in the space between equations where intuition operated, where mathematical sense developed through months of continuous work told him which approaches might succeed and which were doomed to fail. This internal space, this territory of unwritten mathematics, expanded during the plague years beyond what should be possible, beyond what normal human consciousness can sustain. Some believe this was the gift of sleeplessness, that by refusing to let consciousness reset nightly, Newton maintained a continuity that allowed calculations to build across days without the forgetting that ordinarily occurs, without the loss of subtle relationships that sleep normally erases. But continuity is not the same as capacity. The mind stretched too far does not become stronger. It becomes fragile, becomes prone to errors that fatigue introduces, to confusions that exhaustion multiplies, to the blurring of boundaries between what is calculated and what is assumed, between what is proven and what merely seems true to consciousness too tired to distinguish anymore. His notebooks from this period show evidence of both brilliance and breakdown. Pages of calculations executed with perfect precision, followed by pages where the same calculation produces different results, where errors creep in that Newton would have caught easily if properly rested, where the handwriting itself deteriorates into something barely legible, suggesting a hand that trembled with exhaustion, a mind that could barely direct the pen, a consciousness operating so far beyond sustainable limits that even the physical act of writing became difficult. Became testament to how far he had pushed himself in pursuit of understanding that seemed always just beyond reach, always requiring one more calculation, one more sleepless night, one more violation of the body's desperate pleas for rest. Where memory fades into the fragmentary evidence of scattered notes and later recollections, we find hints of what those months cost him physically. Headaches that would force him to stop working for hours, though even then he would not sleep, would merely lie in darkness waiting for pain to subside enough that calculation could resume. Eyes that would not focus properly, that saw double or triple until he learned to close one eye, to reduce sensory input, to manage the overload that came from consciousness stretched thin across too many variables, too many simultaneous calculations, too many hours without the reset that sleep provides. He described once, years later, the sensation of his thoughts, spiraling during the plague years, pursuing connections that seemed meaningful but led nowhere, following tangents that consumed hours before revealing themselves as dead ends, getting lost in mathematical spaces so complex that finding his way back to the original question required conscious effort, required deliberately retracing steps that exhaustion had already begun to erase from memory. This spiral quality, this sense of thought pursuing itself in ever-tightening loops, suggests consciousness approaching the edge of coherence, maintaining function through sheer determination, but losing the natural flow that characterizes healthy thinking, the easy movement from question to answer that requires rest to sustain. And yet, despite the cost, despite the suffering, despite the evidence accumulating in his own body that this was unsustainable, that the practices would eventually destroy him, the insights came. The mathematics worked, the calculations balanced. And one day, after months of pursuit, after countless failed approaches and abandoned methods, after pushing consciousness to limits it should never reach, Newton achieved what he had sought. Proof that the same force that pulled apples earthward held the moon in its orbit, that gravity was universal, that the cosmos operated by principles that could be grasped, could be calculated, could be understood through mathematics elegant enough to describe with a single equation what had seemed to require separate explanations for heaven and earth. The weight of falling things became the weight of understanding, became the burden of knowledge that could not be unknown, that would transform how humanity perceived the universe, but would also mark Newton permanently, with the cost of acquiring it. Because to achieve this understanding, he had to hold in mind simultaneously the apple's descent and the moon's orbit, the mathematics of instantaneous change and the geometry of elliptical motion, the known and the unknown. The proven and the hypothetical had to maintain all of this across weeks and months without the nightly erasure that sleep provides, without the forgetting that allows consciousness to approach problems fresh each morning rather than carrying forward every failure, every false start, every exhausting dead end. Marked by the calculations that filled hundreds of pages, marked by the months of pursuit that consumed him so completely that food and sleep and the world beyond his shuttered windows ceased to matter, marked by the physical toll written in trembling hands and unfocused eyes, and the headaches that came with increasing frequency. Newton's understanding of gravity was also understanding of what consciousness can endure, what it can achieve when pushed beyond all reasonable limits, and what it loses in the achieving. Did the apple's fall pull him toward understanding or toward collapse? Both, perhaps. The question that began with simple observation of falling fruit became the weight that pulled him down, that made sleep impossible because the mind raced even when the body begged for rest. That transformed him from curious scholar into something else, something that had sacrificed normal human functioning to the pursuit of truth about how the universe holds itself together, how forces operate across empty space, how the same mathematics describes phenomena separated by scales so vast that intuition insists they must be governed by different principles. But intuition was wrong. And proving it wrong required not intuition but calculation, not insight alone, but the relentless grinding work of mathematics pursued across months, across the edge of breakdown, across territories where consciousness should not venture, but where Newton went because the question demanded it, because the weight of not knowing was heavier than the weight of exhaustion, because falling things would not let him rest until he understood what made them fall. What invisible force reached up from Earth's center and pulled everything toward it with strength that diminished with distance, but never quite reached zero, never quite released its hold, extending outward to the moon and beyond, perhaps infinitely, perhaps governing the entire cosmos through mathematics so simple and elegant that discovering them seemed almost too easy, seemed like they should have been found long ago, except that finding them required someone willing to pay the price Newton paid. Willing to sacrifice sleep and health and sanity to pursue calculations that seemed endless, that spiraled and branched and demanded more and more until finally, mercifully, they converged, they balanced, they revealed the pattern that unified everything and allowed Newton to finally briefly rest. But the rest did not restore him, could not restore him. Because the damage was done, the patterns established, the capacity for normal sleep destroyed by months of refusing it, by the weight of understanding that could not be set down even when consciousness begged for release, by the falling things that pulled him down not physically, but mentally, spiritually, into depths from which normal rhythms could never fully retrieve him. Leaving him permanently marked by those plague year months when apples fell and moons orbited, and a young man calculated until calculation itself became the only reality, the only purpose, the only thing standing between him and the terror of not knowing, the weight of ignorance that proved heavier than any physical burden, heavier than exhaustion, heavier even than the accumulated cost of sleepless months, until one day the weight shifted, the understanding emerged. And Newton discovered that knowledge is also weight, that understanding also pulls downward, that gravity's secrets once learned become gravity of a different kind, the force that would hold him forever in the orbit of those plague years, circling back always to the memory of when apples fell and sleep was refused, and the weight of falling things became the weight of everything, the burden of knowing what cannot be unknown. The permanent cost of understanding purchased through practices that should never be repeated, but that produced insights that can never be surrendered, leaving only the question that falls through centuries like fruit from invisible branches. Was it worth it? Was any understanding worth this price? And would Newton, if given the choice again, choose differently? Or would the question's weight prove too great? Would the pull of not knowing prove too strong? Would he fall again into the same patterns, the same sleepless pursuit, the same violation of every healthy boundary, proving that some weights cannot be resisted, some things must fall, some prices must be paid regardless of cost, because consciousness, once awakened to certain questions, cannot rest until those questions are answered, cannot sleep until understanding arrives, cannot stop falling until it discovers what makes things fall and learns too late that understanding is also falling, is also weight, is also the force that pulls us down into territories from which there is no climbing back, no return to the innocent ignorance that existed before the apple fell, before the question formed, before the weight of wanting to understand became heavier than anything gravity alone could impose. Became the force that would govern the remainder of Newton's life, just as surely as his equations governed the moon's orbit, just as inevitably, just as inescapably, pulled by forces he had discovered, but could not escape, falling still, always falling, through decades of disordered sleep and exhausted waking, falling through the remainder of his life like apples fall through air pulled downward by understanding that would not release him, by knowledge that would not let him rest, by the weight of falling things that proved to be the weight of consciousness itself, pulled inevitably toward the ground where all falling ends, where all weights come to rest, where even Newton would eventually find the sleep he had denied himself during the plague years, when apples fell and questions formed, and a young man learned what it costs to understand why things fall, learned that understanding is also falling, also weight, also the force from which there is no escape. Only the long descent toward the final rest where all weights are lifted, all questions cease, all falling ends in the darkness that waited patiently through all those sleepless years, waiting to receive him, waiting to prove that gravity always wins, that all things fall eventually, that even consciousness that reaches for the stars must return to earth, must find at last the rest it refused, the weight it can no longer carry, the final falling that brings not understanding but peace, not knowledge but release. Not answers but the blessed silence where questions no longer matter, and the weight of falling things is finally, mercifully, set down. In the darkest hours of his isolation, when even mathematics could no longer hold his attention, when his eyes would not focus on symbols and his mind would not follow calculations, when exhaustion had reached levels that made abstract thought impossible but sleep remained inaccessible, Newton would turn to work of a different kind. Physical work. Work that required hands more than mind, touch more than thought, the slow grinding of metal into curves so precise they could catch starlight and focus it to points sharp enough to pierce the darkness. He built telescopes, not with lenses those he had already mastered, had already understood their fundamental flaw, the chromatic aberration that split white light into unwanted rainbows and made distant stars appear surrounded by colored halos. Lenses failed because they refracted light, and refraction separated colors, and colors could not be perfectly recombined. But mirrors were different. Mirrors reflected without dispersing. Mirrors could gather light and focus it without the distortions that glass introduced. It is said that Newton ground his first mirror by candlelight, working through hours when the plague-emptied village beyond his manor slept, when the only consciousness awake in miles of English countryside was his own, when the solitude was so complete that even the sound of his breathing seemed intrusive, seemed to violate some sacred silence that the darkness demanded. The work was slow, was meditative, was perhaps the closest thing to rest that he allowed himself during those years, not sleep, never sleep, but at least a different mode of consciousness, a different kind of attention that gave his exhausted mind respite from the relentless demands of calculation. The mirror began as a disc of metal speculum, an alloy of copper and tin that could be polished to reflective brilliance if you had patience enough, if you were willing to spend hours, days, weeks removing material atom by atom, until the surface curved in a parabola so perfect that parallel rays of light would converge to a single point, that stars separated by vast distances would focus to positions that could be measured, mapped, understood. Beneath the silence of this work, beneath the rhythmic motion of grinding and checking and grinding again, Newton's consciousness operated differently than it did during his mathematical labors. The telescope work was embodied, was tactile, required attending to sensations that mathematics ignored, the feel of metal beneath fingertips, the resistance of material being shaped, the immediate feedback that told him when the curve was too steep or too shallow, when more grinding was needed, or when precision had been achieved. Some believe this physical work saved him during the plague years. That without this outlet, without this different mode of engagement, his consciousness would have fragmented completely under the sustained assault of abstract thought, of mathematical pursuit that recognized no natural stopping point, that could continue endlessly if allowed because there were always more questions, always deeper problems, always territories beyond whatever had just been understood. But the mirrors had natural endpoints, had completion. You could finish grinding a mirror, could achieve the parabolic curve, could polish the surface to reflective perfection and declare the work done in ways that mathematics never allowed, never permitted, never reached because understanding always revealed new ignorance, always opened more questions than it closed. Where memory fades into the uncertain accounts of later years, into Newton's own fragmentary descriptions of the plague-time work, we find references to testing the mirrors against stars he observed from windows he otherwise kept shuttered. The process required darkness, absolute darkness, so that even faint starlight would be visible, would be sufficient to test whether the mirror focused properly, whether the parabolic curve was accurate, whether the years of grinding had produced an instrument that could extend human vision beyond what the naked eye perceives, that could make distant things near, could bring celestial objects into clarity that had existed only as dim points of light, barely distinguishable from the darkness that surrounded them. But testing the mirrors meant maintaining consciousness through the hours when stars were visible, meant extending his already extreme wakefulness into the depths of night, meant working by starlight so faint that even the smallest error in the mirror's curve would be obvious, would scatter light that should have focused, would reveal imperfections invisible in daylight or candlelight, would demand more grinding, more shaping, more weeks of work before the next test could be attempted. How many mirrors did he grind during those plague years? The historical record suggests several, though exact numbers are uncertain. Lost to time and Newton's own incomplete documentation of work, he perhaps considered secondary to his mathematical pursuits. But each mirror represented months of effort, months of attention sustained at levels beyond what ordinary consciousness can maintain. Months of consciousness operating in darkness, broken only by candle flame and starlight, in isolation so complete that the mirrors themselves became companions, became presences in the shuttered rooms, became the only things that reflected back his own image though distorted, curved, transformed by the parabolic surface into something unrecognizable, into a self he could not quite identify, could not quite claim as his own. The mirrors reflected nothing in the sense that they showed him nothing he wanted to see. Tested against stars, they revealed only whether the curve was correct, whether the grinding had achieved precision, whether the mathematics that predicted how parabolic surfaces focus light matched the physical reality of metal shaped by hand. But they did not reflect understanding, did not reflect meaning, did not reflect anything except light, pure and simple, following rules that were mathematical rather than human, that cared nothing for the exhausted consciousness that had ground the metal into curves capable of gathering starlight. Marked by the hours that became weeks that became months of this work, marked by hands that developed calluses in patterns unique to mirror grinding, marked by eyes that adapted to working in near darkness and lost some capacity to function in full daylight, Newton's relationship with the mirrors grew complex. They were tools, yes. Were instruments for extending vision, for testing optical theories, for demonstrating that reflecting telescopes could surpass refracting ones, could avoid chromatic aberration while achieving magnifications previously impossible. But they were also something else. Were talismans against the isolation. Were proof that hands still worked when mind grew too tired to calculate. Were evidence that slow, patient, physical labor could achieve completion in ways that abstract thought could not, could produce objects that were finished, done, successful or failed, but either way complete rather than the endless work in progress that mathematics represented, that consumed consciousness without ever quite satisfying it, without ever reaching the point where Newton could declare himself done, could set down the pen and feel he had accomplished something final rather than merely provisional. Merely the next step in a journey that seemed to have no destination, only the relentless progression toward understanding that always remained just beyond reach. Some nights, after hours of grinding, after his hands had grown too numb to feel the metal's resistance, after his eyes could no longer judge the curve's precision, Newton would hold the mirror and stare into its distorted reflection. Would see himself transformed by the parabolic surface into something strange, something elongated or compressed depending on the angle, something that was recognizably him, but also utterly alien, a self reshaped by forces he had calculated but could not quite control, could not quite predict in all their effects. Did he recognize what he was seeing? Did the distorted reflection carry meaning beyond optics, beyond the simple physics of curved surfaces? Did some part of him understand that the self he had been, when he arrived at Woolsthorpe the young scholar, properly rested, synchronized with the world's rhythms, had been ground away during the plague years, just as surely as he had ground away the metal's surface, shaped into something new through processes that were precise and calculated, but also destructive, that created the parabolic curve by removing everything that wasn't parabolic. That made the mirror capable of focusing starlight by eliminating everything that would scatter or distort. The mirrors that reflected nothing reflected everything, in their way, reflected the cost of precision, reflected the price of achieving perfection in any domain that perfection requires, the grinding away of imperfection, the removal of everything extraneous, the slow reduction until only the essential remains, until the curve is perfect, and the starlight focuses, but the self that achieved this perfection is no longer quite recognizable, has been reshaped by the same processes it applied to metal, has become itself a kind of mirror, capable of reflecting reality with uncanny precision, but incapable of reflecting anything of its own nature, anything of the consciousness that looks through it toward stars it will never reach, toward understanding it will never fully achieve, toward completion that remains always beyond the next test, the next grinding, the next sleepless night of work that cannot be abandoned, because abandonment would mean admitting that all the grinding was for nothing, that the mirrors reflect nothing that matters. That precision is not the same as meaning, and focus is not the same as understanding, and the starlight gathered so carefully reveals only more darkness, more distance, more territory beyond human reach, no matter how perfect the instruments become, no matter how precise the curves, no matter how many sleepless hours are spent grinding metal into shapes that can gather light, but cannot generate it, that can focus what stars provide, but cannot create illumination of their own, that remain forever dependent on external sources, forever passive receivers of light that comes from beyond, from distances so vast that the light itself is ancient by the time it reaches the mirror, by the time it focuses to the point where Newton's exhausted eyes can perceive it and record it and incorporate it into his understanding of the cosmos that grows more precise with each observation, but never quite complete, never quite finished, always requiring one more mirror, one more test. One more sleepless night of work that begins as respite from mathematics and becomes its own obsession, its own relentless demand, its own violation of the body's need for rest, proving that physical work is no more sustainable than mental work when pursued without pause, without sleep, without the nightly dissolution that allows both body and mind to recover, to renew, to approach the next day's work with capacity restored rather than depleted, with energy replenished rather than borrowed from reserves that grow thinner with each passing week, with each mirror ground, with each star observed, with each reflection that shows nothing except a self transformed beyond recognition by processes meant to create precision, but that created also damage, distortion, the permanent reshaping of consciousness that believed it was grinding mirrors, but was actually being ground itself, was actually being shaped by the work as much as the work was shaped by it, was actually becoming a mirror of a different kind, one that reflected reality with increasing accuracy, but reflected nothing of itself, that had lost the capacity to see its own transformation, to recognize its own distortion, to understand that the plague-year mirrors that reflected nothing had actually reflected the most important truth of all. That consciousness shaped to perfect precision loses something essential in the shaping, that the self ground smooth enough to focus starlight cannot quite focus on itself anymore, cannot quite see what it has become in pursuit of seeing everything else, cannot quite acknowledge the cost until decades later when the mirrors are long since completed and tested and proven, and the only thing left to reflect on is the question that has no answer. Were the mirrors worth it? Was the starlight worth the grinding? Was precision worth the price? And would the mirrors, if they could speak, if they could reflect anything except light's pure trajectory, tell Newton that yes, it was worth it, the cosmos revealed itself through your instruments, your vision extended beyond human limits? Or would they remain silent as they always remained, reflecting nothing, revealing nothing except what others bring to them, what stars provide, what light delivers from distances so vast they might as well be infinite, leaving Newton alone with his reflections that reflect nothing, his mirrors that show everything except what he most needs to see? That the grinding never ends, the shaping never ceases, the transformation never completes, and the self that emerged from the plague years is itself a kind of mirror now perfect for certain purposes, useless for others, capable of focusing on the infinite but unable to focus on the immediate, able to gather distant starlight but unable to rest in simple darkness, able to reflect the cosmos with uncanny precision, but unable to reflect on its own nature, its own cost, its own slow grinding away of everything that wasn't essential for the work, leaving only the parabolic curve, the perfect focus, the capacity to extend vision toward stars while losing the capacity to see what was lost in the grinding, what was sacrificed to precision, what the mirrors reflected all along even as they seemed to reflect nothing. The truth that some transformations are irreversible, some grinding cannot be undone, some mirrors once made cannot be unimagined, and the starlight they gather, beautiful and distant and cold, illuminates everything except the darkness that made the mirrors necessary, that made precision possible, that made Newton into the instrument through which the universe observed itself, but at the cost of his own capacity to be anything except instrument, anything except mirror. Anything except the perfectly ground surface that reflects reality, but reflects nothing of the consciousness that created it, that shaped it, that spent plague year months grinding away everything that wasn't essential, until all that remained was the capacity to focus, to gather, to reflect, and the question, unanswerable as distant stars, of what was lost in the grinding, what the mirrors would reveal if they could reflect more than light, if they could show Newton what he had become in the making of them. If they could speak the truth that gleams in every polished surface, that we become what we create, that the instruments reshape the instrument maker, that the mirrors that reflected nothing reflected everything, showing in their silence and their perfection and their cold metallic curves the cost of achieving precision, the price of extending vision, the permanent transformation of consciousness that ground metal into parabolas and ground itself into something that could no longer quite rest, could no longer quite sleep, could no longer quite exist except in the work of grinding and testing and grinding again, forever seeking the perfect curve, the perfect focus, the perfect reflection that would never come because perfection is not a destination, but a direction, not an achievement, but a pursuit, not completion, but the eternal grinding away of imperfection that never quite ends, never quite reaches the point where the mirror is finished, and the work can stop and rest, can finally come because for Newton, after the plague years, after the mirrors, rest would never quite come again, would never quite be possible, would remain forever just beyond reach like starlight focused to a point he could see but never touch, never grasp, never hold except in the brief moments before exhaustion forced him to stop, to set down the grinding tool, to acknowledge that even mirrors have limits, even precision has costs, even perfection requires sacrifices that cannot be calculated in advance, can only be discovered after the grinding is done, and the mirror is complete and consciousness, looking into its curved surface, sees nothing it recognizes, nothing it can claim, nothing except the distorted reflection of a self that ground itself away in the pursuit of gathering starlight, proving that sometimes what we create in our search for light reveals only darkness, the darkness of what was lost, what was sacrificed, what the mirrors reflected all along even as they seemed to reflect nothing at all. For 2 years, perhaps more, the chronology uncertain because Newton's own records grew disordered as the isolation extended, as the distinction between days blurred and then dissolved, as time itself became something measured only by completed work rather than by the sun's patient rising and setting beyond shuttered windows. He existed in a state that had no observers except himself. No one visited Woolsthorpe during the plague. The roads that connected the manor to Cambridge, to London, to the rest of England, might as well have been severed. The plague made travelers suspect, made approach dangerous, made isolation not just preferred but enforced by the unspoken agreement that distance meant survival, that contact meant risk, that the only safety lay in complete withdrawal into whatever shelter you could find and waiting, alone, for death to finish its work among the living. Newton's isolation was total. This cannot be overstated, cannot be exaggerated. Modern consciousness, accustomed to constant connection, to the digital presence of others even in physical solitude, cannot quite grasp what it means to be utterly, completely alone for years. No voices except his own. No faces except the distorted reflection in his mirrors. No confirmation that the world beyond the manor still existed, except the distant smoke from chimneys miles away. The faint evidence that some others still survived, still lit fires, still occupied the landscape that the plague had made into a territory of the living dead. Those who waited to see if they would be among the survivors, or among the silent majority that the sickness claimed. Beneath the silence of those unwitnessed years lived a danger that Newton perhaps did not fully recognize until much later, if he recognized it at all. Human consciousness evolved for social existence. Our sense of self, our grasp on reality, our ability to distinguish between what is truly happening and what we merely imagine, these capacities depend on social feedback, on the mirror that other consciousnesses provide, reflecting back our state, our behavior, our patterns, allowing us to calibrate our own functioning against external standards, against the shared reality that social existence creates and maintains. But Newton had no such mirror. Had no one to observe that his patterns had become strange, unsustainable, damaging. Had no one to notice that he was eating irregularly, sleeping barely, working at intensities that should not be maintained. Had no one to say, rest. Had no one to intervene when the vigil extended too long, when the work consumed too completely, when the practices that might be sustainable briefly became patterns that would persist permanently, etching themselves into consciousness too deeply to erase when finally much later, when the plague subsided and the world opened again, external observers returned and saw what the isolation had created. What happened in those unwitnessed hours? What patterns developed when there was no social check, no external judgment, no one to reflect back the strangeness of working through the night, sleeping 2 hours at dawn, waking to resume calculations that had never truly stopped, that continued in dreams if his brief surrenders to exhaustion could be called dreams that persisted in the half-conscious states between waking and sleeping where Newton increasingly existed, where the boundary between the two had worn so thin that neither seemed quite real. Neither seemed quite reliable, and the only certainty was the work, the mathematics, the optical experiments, the mirrors being ground, the questions being pursued regardless of what hour it was, what day, what season. His notebooks from this period show evidence of disorder beneath the apparent order. The calculations are mostly correct, yes. The observations are precise, but the organization breaks down. Pages are undated. Sequences that should be consecutive are separated by other work, other tangents, suggesting a mind that jumped between problems without clear plan, without the structure that normal academic work imposes, without the external rhythms that would have kept different projects separate. That would have prevented everything from blurring together into the continuous stream, that Newton's work became calculus bleeding into optics, bleeding into gravity, bleeding into alchemy, bleeding into pure mathematics, bleeding into philosophical speculation, bleeding into observations of phenomena he could not explain and perhaps should not have been observing at all, should not have been noticing at all, because they suggested consciousness operating beyond normal parameters. Perceiving things that might or might not be real, recording experiences that might be insights or symptoms, discoveries or hallucinations generated by isolation, so complete that the mind had begun creating its own company, its own feedback, its own confirmation of its own perceptions because no external confirmation was available. Where does sanity live? Not in isolated consciousness, this much seems certain. Sanity is social achievement, collective construction, the agreement we make about what is real and what is imagined, what is perception and what is delusion. But Newton had no such agreement during the plague years. Had only his own judgment, his own assessment, his own determination of whether the things he perceived were actually there, or whether exhaustion and isolation were combining to create experiences that had no external correlate, that existed only in consciousness, stretched so thin it had begun to generate its own content, to populate the empty rooms with presences that were real to it, but to no one else, because no one else existed in those rooms, in those years, in that total isolation. Some believe this was liberation, that without observers, Newton was free to pursue whatever interested him without social constraint, without the judgments that academia would have imposed, without the need to explain or justify or moderate his practices to meet others' expectations. And perhaps there is truth in this. Perhaps the plague year's productivity required exactly this freedom, this absence of external structure, this elimination of all demands except the demands he placed upon himself. But freedom and abandonment can be difficult to distinguish. What looks like liberation might also be isolation so complete that no one remains to help, to intervene, to notice when patterns cross from productive to pathological, when intensity becomes unsustainable, when the vigil that seems necessary becomes the vigil that will never quite end because the capacity to end it, to rest, to return to normal rhythms has been eroded beyond recovery by the very practices that seem to make the work possible. The manor stood silent. Days passed into nights that passed into days without witness, without record, without anything to mark their passage except the work that accumulated, the pages that filled, the insights that emerged, but also the damage that accumulated silently, invisibly, in systems that performed flawlessly until they didn't, that sustained the impossible until they couldn't, that allowed Newton to believe he had transcended human limitations when actually he was demonstrating them, was proving through his own experience that consciousness cannot operate indefinitely without rest, that isolation extended too long damages the very faculties it seems to liberate, that the vigil no one witnessed was also the vigil no one could stop, no one could interrupt, no one could save Newton from except Newton himself, and Newton would not stop, could not stop, had lost the capacity to recognize that stopping was needed, was necessary, was the only way to preserve what the continuous work was slowly destroying. Marked by the seasons that changed beyond windows he did not open, marked by the progress of plague that he learned about only through distant smoke and occasional rumors, marked by time that continued its flow whether or not any consciousness observed it, Newton's unwitnessed vigil extended. 1 year became 2. 2 years became the pattern that would persist beyond the plague years, that would characterize the rest of his life, that would mark him permanently as someone who existed slightly apart, slightly displaced, slightly unable to fully rejoin the social rhythms he had abandoned during the isolation. And when finally the plague subsided, when finally Cambridge reopened, when finally others could approach and observe and witness the result of those unobserved years, what they found troubled them in ways they could not quite articulate. Newton had achieved extraordinary things. This was undeniable. The mathematics was revolutionary. The optical work was brilliant. The insights about gravity would transform physics. But the man who had achieved these things was strange, was damaged, was operating according to patterns that social existence could not quite accommodate, that marked him as permanently other, permanently displaced from the shared reality that most humans inhabit. Perhaps this was necessary. Perhaps the insights required exactly this displacement. But perhaps also the displacement was simply damage, simply the cost of isolation extended too long, of work pursued without witness, of patterns developed with no external check, of consciousness operating so long alone that it forgot how to operate any other way. That lost the capacity to be anything except isolated, except vigilant, except the observer that no one observed, the worker that no one witnessed, the consciousness that spent plague years alone and would, in some essential sense, remain alone forever after, carrying the mark of those unwitnessed years, unable to fully explain what happened because no language exists to describe experiences that occurred in complete isolation, that had no observers, that remain forever private not because Newton chose privacy, but because privacy was enforced by plague, by isolation, by the vigil that no one witnessed, and that therefore exists only in his memory, only in his notebooks. Only in the permanent patterns it etched into consciousness that would never quite recover, never quite return to the shared reality where others live together, observe each other, moderate each other, prevent through their presence the kind of extremity that develops only when no one is watching, when consciousness believes it is completely alone and acts accordingly, developing patterns that seem normal because they are the only patterns available, seeming productive because no alternative exists for comparison, seeming sustainable because no one remains to say that no, this is not sustainable, this will destroy you, this will mark you forever, and by the time anyone could say these things, could warn him, could intervene, the damage was done, the patterns were established. The vigil had consumed the consciousness that began it, leaving in its place something that could work brilliantly but could not quite rest, could not quite sleep, could not quite exist except in the continuous present of the work that had become the only reality, the only witness, the only observer of the vigil that no one else observed, and that therefore might as well have been invisible, might as well have occurred in some other dimension entirely, leaving only its traces, the notebooks, the mirrors, the mathematics as evidence that something happened during those plague years in the manner where time stopped and isolation became total, and a young man conducted a vigil that no one witnessed, but that witnesses everything still, that echoes through centuries in the work it produced, but also in the warning it provides. That some things should be witnessed, should be observed, should not be left to consciousness operating completely alone, because alone, consciousness can convince itself of anything, can normalize any pattern, can sustain any practice no matter how destructive, as long as the destruction remains invisible, as long as no mirror reflects it back, as long as the vigil continues unwatched and unwatchable, and therefore unopposed, and therefore capable of extending far beyond what should be sustainable into territories where damage becomes permanent, and patterns become prison, and the only observer is the observed, and the observed is too exhausted to observe accurately anymore, can only continue the vigil because continuation is all it knows, all it remembers, all it can imagine in the rooms where no one watches and no one witnesses and no one remains to say, "Rest now, the vigil is over, you have done enough, you can stop," except that stopping would require someone to grant permission, and no one is there to grant it, and so the vigil continues past the plague years, continues past the return to Cambridge, continues through decades that follow, continues until death finally provides what the vigil itself never could. An end, a cessation, a final release from the patterns established during the years when no one watched, and therefore no one could stop the watching, the working, the relentless vigilance that became the only thing consciousness knew how to do, the only mode it could operate in, the only reality it recognized after the plague years when isolation was total, and the vigil was unwatched, and Newton became both observer and observed, both witness and phenomenon, both consciousness and the strange territory that consciousness explores when left completely alone with nothing to moderate it, nothing to stop it, nothing to save it from itself except the final darkness where all vigils end and all watchers rest, and even Newton, who watched so long unwatched, finally closes eyes that will not open again, will not resume the vigil, will not continue the watching that defined him, that marked him, that emerged from the plague years when no one witnessed what was happening, and therefore no one could prevent what would happen for the rest of his life, the continuation of patterns established in isolation, the persistence of practices developed with no observer, the eternal vigil that began when plague made witnesses impossible and continued because vigilance, once established absolutely, becomes impossible to abandon, becomes the only thing consciousness knows, becomes the inheritance of those years when the manor stood silent and Newton worked alone and no one witnessed what was being created. Not just mathematics, not just optics, but also the permanent transformation of consciousness into something that could not stop watching, could not stop working, could not stop the vigil that had begun in isolation and would end only when consciousness itself ended, when the final unwatched moment came and Newton, who had spent plague years alone, spent his final years essentially alone despite the company of others, despite the social world he had rejoined, remaining always somehow separate, somehow still conducting the vigil that no one witnessed, that no one could witness because it had become entirely internal, entirely private, entirely the result of those years when watching was all there was, and watching became all there would ever be, leaving only the question that persists. What happened in the vigil that no one witnessed? What did Newton become when no one was watching? And can we ever truly know? Or does the absence of witnesses mean the truth remains forever private, forever locked in the consciousness that experienced it, forever beyond our reach except in the traces it left, the patterns it established, the permanent mark of those years when the vigil was unwatched and unwatchable, and therefore unknowable except to the one who lived it, who survived it, who emerged from the plague years changed in ways that witnesses could observe but never quite understand, never quite account for, never quite explain except to say. Something happened there, in that manner, in those years, something that no one saw and that changed everything, something that made Newton into Newton but also into something else, something that could work without rest, watch without sleep, continue the vigil that began when plague made isolation total, and that continued until death made it impossible, until the watching finally ceased, and the vigil ended, and the consciousness that had spent plague years alone finally found the rest it had denied itself. The release it had never permitted, the end of watching that comes only when there is nothing left to watch, no consciousness left to do the watching, no vigil left to keep except the one that memory keeps, that history keeps, that these words keep as we contemplate the vigil that no one witnessed and wonder what it cost, what it created, what it revealed about the dangers of isolation extended too long, of consciousness operating without external check, of the human need for witnesses not just to our achievements, but to our suffering, to our extremity, to the patterns that develop when no one watches, and therefore no one stops what should be stopped before it becomes permanent, before it becomes the vigil that cannot end, before watching becomes the only thing we know how to do, and rest becomes the thing we have forgotten how to find. Would you like me to continue with chapters 712? Newton's pulse raced constantly during those plague years. This detail appears in his private notes, mentioned almost casually among calculations about planetary motion and observations about light's refraction, as though rapid heartbeat were simply another phenomenon to be measured, another aspect of reality to be quantified and recorded alongside the laws of falling bodies and the mathematics of curved mirrors. But the racing pulse was not curiosity, was not academic interest, was symptom evidence of a nervous system pushed beyond its limits, of a body in permanent state of alertness that should be temporary, that evolved to handle emergencies lasting minutes or hours, but not the sustained wakefulness that Newton imposed across months, across seasons, across the entire span of the plague years. It is said that he would pause sometimes in his calculations to press fingers against his wrist, to count the beats that came too fast, too irregular, too strong against his skin. 80, 90. 100 beats per minute while sitting still, while doing nothing more strenuous than holding a pen, while consciousness remained focused on abstract mathematics that should require no physical exertion, but that somehow demanded everything from a body already depleted, already operating on reserves that should have been exhausted weeks or months earlier, but that persisted through mechanisms science could not yet explain, and that Newton would not have paused to investigate even if the tools existed. Because investigating would mean acknowledging, and acknowledging would mean admitting that something was wrong, that the practices were unsustainable, that the body was failing under demands that exceeded all reasonable tolerance. His breathing remained shallow, rapid. Like someone who had been running, though he sat motionless in his chair, though the only movement was the pen across paper, though his body occupied the same position for hours, while his mind raced through territories that required a different kind of energy, a different kind of expenditure that left him gasping sometimes, left him pausing mid-calculation to draw deeper breaths, to try to slow the racing that seemed to have no physical cause except the simple fact of consciousness operating at intensities that biological systems were never designed to sustain. Beneath the silence of his study, beneath the scratch of pen and the occasional shifting of his chair, Newton's body waged a war it could not win. The autonomic nervous system, designed to alternate between states sympathetic arousal for action, parasympathetic calm for rest and recovery, had become locked in permanent activation. The fight-or-flight response that should trigger only in danger, only when survival demands immediate action, had become his baseline state, had persisted so long that his body no longer remembered how to return to neutral, how to achieve the parasympathetic dominance that characterizes rest, that allows heartbeat to slow and breathing to deepen and consciousness to release its grip on perpetual vigilance. Some believe this was simply the cost of intense intellectual work, of concentration sustained beyond normal limits. But the symptoms suggest something more fundamental, more physiological than mere mental effort could account for. Newton was experiencing what we would now recognize as chronic stress response, as the sustained activation of systems meant to be temporary, as the breakdown that occurs when emergency protocols run continuously, when the body never receives the signal that danger has passed, that rest is permitted, that the vigilance can cease. His hands trembled when he tried to perform delicate experiments. The notebooks record this, though Newton rarely commented on it explicitly, just the occasional note that an observation had to be abandoned, because his hands would not remain steady, because the tremor made precision impossible, because the body refused to obey the mind's commands with the accuracy that optical work demanded. He developed compensations, would rest his hands against stable surfaces, would work only during brief periods when the trembling subsided, would accept lower precision rather than abandoning experiments entirely. But the trembling was message, was the body's desperate communication in the only language available, physical symptom, visible evidence that systems were failing, that the continuous demands exceeded what flesh could sustain. The tremor said, rest, said, stop, said, this is destroying you. But Newton heard only interference, only obstacle to be overcome, only evidence that will needed to be stronger, that determination needed to be fiercer, that the body's weakness was problem to be solved through more work, not less, through pushing harder, not pausing, through insisting that biology bend to consciousness rather than acknowledging that consciousness depends on biology and biology has limits that cannot be negotiated away. His vision would blur and double until he learned to close one eye. This adaptation, this accommodation to failing systems, became so habitual that colleagues in later years would note Newton's peculiar way of looking at things, always slightly tilted, one eye squinted shut, as though he saw the world through a lens that required this particular angle, this specific restriction of input. But the restriction was not optical, was neurological, was the result of a visual system overwhelmed by exhaustion, unable to coordinate the two eyes properly, producing double images that consciousness could not reconcile, could not combine into coherent perception. So Newton learned to see with one eye, learned to reduce input rather than addressing the underlying cause, learned to manage symptoms rather than treating the disease, which was sleeplessness itself, which was the continuous work that allowed no recovery, which was the plague years isolation extending into practices that would persist long after isolation ended, that would characterize his perception forever after the world seen through one eye, because two eyes were too much for a nervous system stretched too thin to coordinate them, too exhausted to perform the basic integration that normal vision requires. Where memory fades into the fragmentary evidence of letters and later accounts, we find references to headaches that would force Newton to stop working for hours. Not the mild discomfort that accompanies ordinary fatigue, but pain so intense it produced nausea, sensitivity to light that made even candle flame unbearable, throbbing that matched his racing pulse, and seemed to announce with each beat that systems were failing, that the brain itself was protesting the demands being placed upon it, that consciousness could not continue operating at these intensities without consequence. But even the headaches were not permission to rest. Were only forced pauses, intervals when work became impossible, not because Newton chose to stop, but because pain made thought impossible, made calculation unattainable, made even opening his eyes an ordeal that consciousness could not endure. He would lie in darkness during these episodes, different darkness from the deliberate darkness of his optical experiments, unwanted darkness of suffering rather than chosen darkness of investigation, and wait for the pain to subside enough that work could resume. Because work always resumed. This was the pattern that the plague years established, that became so deeply etched it could never be fully erased. That rest was not choice but forced cessation, not voluntary surrender but involuntary collapse, not the nightly practice that sustains consciousness, but the emergency shutdown that occurs when systems are pushed beyond all tolerance, when the body simply cannot continue no matter how fiercely will insists, when consciousness itself blinks out not as sleep, but as protective mechanism, as the last defense against damage that would be permanent, irreversible, fatal. Marked by the racing pulse that never slowed, marked by the shallow breathing that never deepened, marked by the trembling hands and blurred vision and headaches that came with increasing frequency, Newton's body kept its own records of the plague years. Records written in flesh rather than ink, in symptoms rather than symbols, in the slow deterioration of systems that should have been sustained by rest, but that were instead consumed by continuous work. By the refusal to acknowledge that biology has requirements that genius cannot override, that consciousness depends on foundations that will crumble if not maintained, that the breath which would not slow was also breath that could not continue indefinitely at these rates, that the heartbeat racing at 100 beats per minute while sitting still was heartbeat wearing itself out, was cardiac muscle that would eventually fail if the demands did not decrease, if rest did not come. If the plague years' patterns did not end, but the patterns did not end, would not end, could not end even when the plague subsided, even when external conditions changed, even when Newton returned to Cambridge and to a world that had survived the sickness and resumed its normal rhythms. Because Newton's rhythms were no longer normal, no longer capable of synchronizing with the world's cycles, no longer able to achieve the parasympathetic state that allows heartbeat to slow and breathing to deepen, and the body to believe that danger has passed, that vigilance can cease, that rest is permitted. Some believe the breath that would not slow became Newton's permanent condition, became the physiological signature that would characterize him for the remaining decades of his life. Accounts from later years describe the same symptoms: the racing pulse, the shallow breathing, the sense that he existed in permanent state of alertness that others experienced only during crisis. As though the plague years had reset his baseline, had taught his nervous system that vigilance was permanent, that rest was weakness, that the only safe state was the activated state, the aroused state, the state that kept breath rapid and pulse racing and consciousness alert even when alertness was not required, even when threats had passed, even when the plague that had made vigilance necessary had long since ended. The body does not forget easily, cannot unlearn patterns established through years of repetition, through months of continuous activation, through the plague years when every moment demanded alertness, because Newton had made every moment matter, had transformed even rest into work, had eliminated the boundary between vigilance and relaxation until only vigilance remained, until the body learned that relaxation was dangerous, was vulnerability, was the state that allowed time to be wasted when time was the most precious resource. When every hour could be used for calculation or observation or grinding mirrors or pursuing understanding, that seemed infinitely more important than the breath that came too fast or the pulse that raced too hard, or the hands that trembled or the vision that blurred or any of the other symptoms that the body produced in its desperate attempt to communicate what consciousness would not acknowledge. That this is unsustainable, that damage is accumulating, that the breath that will not slow is also breath that cannot continue, that the racing heartbeat is heartbeat destroying itself, that the vigilance that seems necessary is vigilance that will eventually destroy the capacity for vigilance itself. Did Newton understand? Some fragmentary evidence suggests he did, at least occasionally, in moments when symptoms became too severe to ignore, when the racing pulse or the headaches or the trembling forced recognition that something was profoundly wrong. But understanding did not lead to change, could not lead to change. Because change would require rest, and rest had become impossible, had been eliminated so thoroughly during the plague years that even the capacity to rest had been eroded, had been replaced by patterns so deep they operated below conscious choice, below will, in territories where the nervous system had learned its lessons too well, had incorporated the plague years' practices too completely, had made permanent what should have been temporary. The breath that would not slow became the breath that could not slow. The emergency response that should have ended when plague ended became the permanent response, the baseline against which all other states were measured. And Newton, who had learned to live with racing pulse and shallow breathing, and all the other symptoms of chronic stress, who had incorporated them into his sense of normal, who no longer even noticed that his body operated differently than others' bodies, that his baseline was their emergency, that what he experienced as ordinary would have been recognized by anyone else as crisis. Newton carried this altered physiology forward through the decades that followed, carried the breath that would not slow, carried the pulse that raced even at rest, carried all the accumulated damage of plague years that had taught his body to forget how to be calm, how to be quiet, how to exist in any state except the activated state that had characterized work that never ceased, vigilance that never ended, consciousness that never rested deeply enough to allow the breath to slow, the heartbeat to calm, the nervous system to discover that the emergency had ended and rest was permitted, and the vigilance could cease. But the vigilance never ceased, the breath never slowed. And the body that carried Newton's genius through his remaining years was also the body permanently marked by the plague year's practices, permanently altered by months of demands that exceeded all tolerance, permanently unable to achieve the calm that others took for granted, the rest that others found naturally, the breath that slowed when danger passed and deepened when sleep arrived and returned to normal, when normal rhythms were restored, except that for Newton, after the plague years, normal rhythms were never restored, normal breath was never recovered, and the racing pulse that had characterized his most productive years became the racing pulse that would accompany him to the grave. That would mark him forever as someone whose body had learned during the plague years that rest was dangerous, and vigilance was survival, and the breath must stay rapid because slowing meant vulnerability and vulnerability meant death. Even though the plague had ended, even though the danger had passed, even though the only thing his racing breath protected him from any more was the rest he needed, the calm his body craved, the slowness that might have allowed recovery if recovery had still been possible, if the damage had not gone too deep, if the breath that would not slow had not become the breath that could not slow, if Newton had not spent plague years teaching his body lessons it would never unlearn, establishing patterns it would never release, creating physiological responses that would persist until the final breath, the final heartbeat, the final moment when racing pulse and shallow breathing finally ceased, not because they slowed, but because they stopped, not because rest arrived, but because life ended, not because Newton found calm, but because calm found him at last in the only form it could reach him anymore. In death, in the final cessation, in the stopping of breath that had never quite slowed, of heartbeat that had never quite calmed, of the vigilance that had persisted from plague years to life's end, proving that some patterns once established cannot be broken, some damage once done cannot be undone, some breath once made rapid cannot be taught to slow again no matter how many years pass, no matter how desperately the body needs the slowness. No matter how clear it becomes that the racing breath is destroying rather than protecting, is harming rather than helping, is the permanent cost of those plague years when Newton learned to breathe rapidly and never learned to breathe slowly again, never recovered the capacity for the deep, slow breath that allows true rest, that permits real recovery, that makes life sustainable across decades rather than the continuous emergency that his life became, that his breath announced with every rapid inhalation, that his racing pulse broadcast with every beat, that his trembling hands and blurred vision and headaches confirmed again and again, until finally, mercifully, the breath that would not slow stopped altogether, the pulse that would not calm ceased entirely, and Newton found at last the stillness he had refused during the plague years, the calm his body had needed all along, the slow, deep, permanent rest where breath no longer races and heartbeat no longer pounds, and the vigilance that characterized his life finally, inevitably, ends. In notebooks he kept separate from his mathematical work, in pages he would later try to hide or destroy, in handwriting that grew more cramped and frantic as the plague years progressed, Newton pursued another kind of knowledge during his vigil. Alchemy, not the crude gold-making of popular imagination, though that was part of it, but something deeper, stranger, more dangerous. The transformation of matter into spirit, the discovery of the philosopher's stone, the uncovering of nature's deepest secrets through processes that combined chemistry and mysticism, observation and prayer, rational experiment and ancient wisdom, passed down through coded texts that Newton read by candlelight in the hours, past midnight, when mathematics could no longer hold his attention, when his mind needed different mysteries to pursue. When the numbers and symbols and geometric proofs gave way to symbols of another kind, alchemical signs, cryptic instructions, recipes for transformations that required not just chemical knowledge but spiritual preparation, not just technical skill but inner purity, not just laboratory apparatus, but the kind of consciousness that could only emerge from sustained wakefulness, from the sleepless vigil that supposedly opened doors to understanding that rest kept permanently closed. The alchemical work required sustained attention across hours, across nights that bled into days, across time spans measured not by the sun's movement, but by the slow transformations occurring in vessels heated over flames that burned continuously, that could not be allowed to extinguish, that demanded the kind of vigilance that only sleeplessness permits. Mercury needed to be watched as it volatilized. Lead needed attention as it changed state. The great work, the magnum opus that would supposedly transmute base metal into gold, and more importantly, transform the alchemist himself into something purified, something closer to divine, required the practitioner to remain present through every stage, to witness every color change, every precipitation, every subtle alteration that might occur in seconds or might require days, that would be missed by anyone who slept, who allowed consciousness to lapse, who failed to maintain the continuous observation that separated true alchemists from mere dabblers. Beneath the silence of his shuttered rooms, in chambers where the plague year's isolation was made even more complete by the secrecy that alchemy demanded, Newton tended furnaces that burned through the night. The smell of it would have been overpowering: sulfur, mercury, the acrid smoke of substances heating and cooling and reacting according to instructions written in code, in symbol, in languages designed to hide as much as reveal. But Newton did not complain about the smell, did not comment on the danger of breathing fumes that we now know were toxic, that were slowly poisoning him even as he believed they were purifying him, that added chemical damage to the physiological damage already accumulating from sleeplessness. Some believe his alchemical pursuits were separate from his scientific work, were embarrassing remnant of medieval thinking that the great rational Newton should have abandoned, should have recognized as nonsense. But Newton saw no contradiction. For him, alchemy and mathematics aimed at the same goal: understanding nature's hidden structures, penetrating beyond appearance to the reality beneath, discovering the laws that govern transformation, change, the movement from one state to another, whether that movement was planetary orbit or chemical reaction, or the purification of consciousness through processes that required both external manipulation of matter and internal discipline of spirit. The texts he studied were ancient, were passed down through centuries of coded transmission, were written to obscure as much as illuminate, to protect secrets from the unworthy, to ensure that only those who had prepared themselves through proper practice could decode the instructions and perform the operations successfully. Newton spent months, years, deciphering these texts, making notes that were themselves coded, that used symbols only he understood, that transformed his notebooks into palimpsests of meaning, mathematical calculation on one page, alchemical recipe on the next, sometimes both on the same page, as though he saw no boundary between them, as though all knowledge was one knowledge, and the only question was which symbolic language to use for which kind of transformation. Where memory fades into the uncertain territory of what Newton believed versus what he could prove, we find references in his alchemical notebooks to experiences that sound more mystical than scientific, to visions that appeared during the long nights of tending furnaces and watching substances transform, to insights that arrived not through deduction, but through revelation. Through the kind of knowing that has no rational basis, but carries absolute certainty, nonetheless the certainty that comes perhaps from exhaustion, so profound it opens consciousness to territories normally inaccessible, or perhaps from chemical fumes altering perception, or perhaps from the strange synergy between sleeplessness and toxic exposure, and the focused attention that alchemy demanded, all combining to create states of consciousness that were neither fully rational nor fully delirious, but something between, something that allowed perception of patterns invisible to ordinary awareness. He wrote of colors that had no names, of transformations that occurred in the subtle realm, invisible to ordinary sight but perceptible to consciousness, properly prepared through fasting and prayer and continuous wakefulness. Of the moment when Mercury would die and resurrect in new form, when the chemical process became direct experience of something more than chemistry, something that touched on consciousness itself, on transformation, on the possibility that matter and spirit were not separate but two aspects of the same underlying reality. Did the sleeplessness make alchemy possible? Or did alchemy justify the sleeplessness? The question cannot be answered definitively, but the pattern is clear. Newton's alchemical work occurred primarily during the hours when others slept, required the kind of sustained attention that only continuous wakefulness permits, demanded vigilance across time spans that would have been impossible for anyone operating on normal sleep cycles. The furnaces could not be left unattended. The processes could not be interrupted. The great work required the alchemist to be present continuously, to maintain consciousness through all stages of transformation, to witness what could only be witnessed by someone willing to sacrifice sleep to the work, to the pursuit, to the possibility of understanding that seemed to require precisely this sacrifice, this violation of normal human rhythms. Marked by the months of plague year nights spent in alchemical pursuit, marked by the toxic fumes inhaled and the sleep refused, and the consciousness stretched across hours of observation that yielded insights he could not articulate except through more symbols, more coded language, more cryptic notes that suggest understanding of something but never quite reveal what that something was. Newton's alchemy remains the most mysterious aspect of his plague years, the work he was least willing to discuss, least able to explain, least capable of defending using the rational methods that characterized his mathematics and physics. Perhaps because alchemy required what rationality could not provide: faith, belief that the ancient texts contained genuine wisdom despite their obscurity, trust that processes requiring months of continuous work would eventually yield results despite no guarantee of success. Commitment to practices that seemed absurd when described: heating mercury for weeks, watching for color changes so subtle they might be imagined, performing operations in specific astrological configurations as though planetary positions actually mattered for chemical reactions, but that made perfect sense when experienced, when lived through. When consciousness was properly prepared through the combination of study and sleeplessness and chemical exposure that supposedly opened perception to subtler levels of reality. The notebooks suggest that Newton achieved something through his alchemical work. Not gold, there is no evidence he ever successfully transmuted base metals, but something else. Some transformation that he valued highly enough to continue the work for decades, to risk his health and sanity, and the reputation that his mathematical and optical work was building. Some understanding that could only be reached through these strange practices, these midnight vigils tending furnaces while others slept, these months of breathing toxic fumes and recording cryptic observations, and pursuing a great work that perhaps had less to do with transforming mercury and more to do with transforming the alchemist himself. With achieving through chemical operations and sleepless observation and coded study some alteration of consciousness that Newton valued more highly than we can now understand, than the historical record can fully capture, than rational explanation can account for. Some believe the alchemy damaged him, that the mercury exposure alone would have been sufficient to cause neurological symptoms, tremors, personality changes, the paranoia that characterized Newton's later years. That the combination of chemical poisoning and sleep deprivation and the psychological effects of pursuing secret knowledge through coded texts created a perfect storm of factors that would explain why the brilliant young mathematician of the plague years became, in later decades, someone strange, someone difficult, someone who seemed to operate by different rules than those governing ordinary human consciousness. But perhaps the damage and the discovery were inseparable. Perhaps the consciousness that could penetrate alchemical mysteries was the same consciousness that had been damaged by the pursuit. Perhaps what Newton found through his sleepless nights, tending furnaces and breathing mercury fumes, and watching for transformations invisible to normal perception, was worth the price he paid, was understanding that justified the cost, was knowledge that could only be achieved through practices that destroyed even as they revealed, that damaged even as they enlightened, that left their practitioner permanently altered, but also permanently in possession of something that rational methods alone could never have discovered. The furnaces eventually cooled. The plague years ended. Newton returned to Cambridge carrying with him notebooks filled with alchemical symbols and cryptic descriptions of processes he would continue pursuing, more privately, more carefully, for the rest of his life. The world would know him for his mathematics, for his optics, for his physics. But Newton knew himself also as alchemist, as seeker of transformations more fundamental than planetary motion, as consciousness that had touched through sleepless nights and chemical operations, territories that his rational mind could observe but never quite explain, could experience but never quite reduce to equations, could value without being able to articulate why the pursuit mattered, why the great work justified the great cost, why the alchemy of sleepless nights was as essential to who he became as the calculus and the gravity and all the rational achievements that history celebrates. Perhaps it was never meant to be separated, the rational and the mystical, the mathematical and the alchemical, the Newton of daylight calculations and the Newton of midnight furnaces. Perhaps the plague years revealed what Newton always understood, but could never quite say. That consciousness operates on multiple levels simultaneously, that understanding requires both reason and something else, something that has no name except perhaps wisdom, something that arrives not through deduction, but through transformation, not through proof, but through the kind of knowing that can only emerge from consciousness willing to sacrifice everything: sleep, health, safety, sanity, to the pursuit of truth that exists beyond what rationality alone can reach. That requires for its discovery the alchemy of sleepless nights, when furnaces burn and substances transform and consciousness, stretched beyond all limits, begins to transform as well, begins to perceive what cannot be perceived by ordinary awareness, begins to know what cannot be known through ordinary methods, begins to become something other than what it was transformed, damaged, enlightened, destroyed, purified, poisoned, all simultaneously, all inseparably. All the result of nights when Newton refused sleep and tended furnaces and pursued the great work that would never quite complete, but that would mark him forever as someone who had touched territories most humans never approach, never imagine, never sacrifice enough to discover, leaving him isolated not just by sleeplessness, but by knowledge of a different kind, understanding of a different order. The permanent mark of the alchemist who pursued transformation and achieved it, but at a cost that can never be fully calculated, never be completely understood, never be anything except the mystery it remains. What did Newton find in those alchemical nights? What did the furnaces reveal? What transformations occurred not in mercury or lead, but in consciousness itself, stretched beyond breaking, poisoned by fumes, sustained by will alone, searching for the philosopher's stone and finding instead something perhaps more valuable, perhaps more terrible than knowledge, that transformation requires sacrifice, that understanding demands cost, that the great work is never the work we think we're doing, but the work being done to us. A slow alchemical transformation of consciousness itself into something that can bear the weight of understanding, that can survive the knowledge, that can carry forward the fruits of plague year nights when furnaces burned and sleep was refused, and alchemy transformed not base metals, but the base matter of consciousness into something refined, something purified, something that had passed through fire and emerged changed, marked, bearing the permanent cost of transformation that can never be reversed, never be undone. Never be anything except the alchemy that continues always, that persists beyond plague years, that marks the consciousness that pursued it as permanently other, permanently altered, permanently bearing the signs of having touched what should not be touched, known what should not be known, transformed what should not be transformed, and survived, barely, carrying forward the understanding that some knowledge cannot be safely possessed, some transformations cannot be safely pursued. Some alchemy exacts prices that only become clear long after the furnaces have cooled, and the great work has ended, and all that remains is the transformed consciousness asking itself whether the transformation was worth it, whether the knowledge justified the cost, whether the alchemy of sleepless nights produced gold, or only fool's gold, wisdom or only its shadow, understanding, or only the elaborate delusion of consciousness damaged beyond its capacity to recognize damage, transformed beyond its ability to remember what it was before transformation, marked forever by the furnaces and the fumes and the sleepless nights pursuing secrets that perhaps should have remained secret, pursuing transformations that perhaps should never be attempted, pursuing the great work that transforms the pursuer more than it transforms anything else, leaving only the question that has no answer except in the cryptic symbols that fill the notebooks, in the coded language that hides more than it reveals, in the silence that follows when the alchemist is asked what was truly discovered during those plague year nights when furnaces burned and consciousness transformed. And the great work occurred not in vessels, but in the mind that tended them, not in substances, but in the substance of consciousness itself, forever altered, forever marked, forever bearing the alchemical signature of having pursued transformation and achieved it, but at a price that can never be fully counted, never be entirely understood, never be anything except the permanent mystery of what Newton found in the alchemy of sleepless nights, and what that alchemy found in him. There came a moment its exact timing lost to history, occurring somewhere in the second year of isolation, when sleep deprivation and obsessive work had pushed Newton's consciousness into territories it was never meant to inhabit, when the boundary between genius and breakdown had worn so thin that perhaps no boundary remained at all when something broke, or something broke through. The distinction impossible to determine then or now, impossible to separate, impossible to say with certainty whether what happened was catastrophe or revelation, whether consciousness shattered or transcended, whether Newton crossed a line or found a doorway, whether the plague years had finally destroyed him or finally elevated him to the understanding he had sought through all those sleepless months of relentless pursuit. The evidence is fragmentary, scattered. The notebooks from this period show handwriting that deteriorates across pages, that starts controlled and ends barely legible, that suggests a hand shaking badly or a mind racing faster than the hand could follow, that records thoughts so disordered they might be nonsense, or might be insights so profound that ordinary notation could not capture them, could only gesture toward them, could only leave traces of understanding that existed beyond the capacity of symbols to fully express. It is said that Newton wrote for 3 days without stopping, not sleeping, not eating, not leaving his chair except when physical necessity absolutely demanded, returning immediately to the work, to the page, to the flood of insights that seemed to arrive faster than he could record, that connected everything mathematics and motion and light and gravity, and the deepest patterns underlying all of physical reality into unified understanding that appeared not as conclusion of patient reasoning, but as vision, as revelation, as gift delivered to consciousness that had prepared itself through months of deprivation and isolation to receive what normal awareness could never perceive. He saw connections suddenly, relationships between phenomena that seemed unrelated, patterns underlying mathematics and motion and light that suggested the universe operated by laws so elegant, so simple in their fundamental nature, that all of physics could be derived from a handful of principles, that everything reduced to geometry and number and the beautiful necessity of mathematical relationship. The universe was one thing, was unified, was comprehensible through principles so basic that Newton experienced not triumph at discovering them, but humility at having failed to see them sooner, at having required so many months of work to perceive what now seemed obvious, undeniable, as clear as daylight though the revelation came in darkness. In the depths of sleepless night, when consciousness had been stretched so far beyond normal limits that it had entered territory where the impossible became thinkable, and the patterns hidden from ordinary perception revealed themselves with blinding clarity. But the vision came with cost. Beneath the cascade of insights, beneath the flood of connections that rewrote his understanding of everything, Newton's body was failing. The 3 days of continuous work left him unable to stand without assistance, left him unable to focus his vision, left him with pulse so rapid and irregular that he feared briefly, in moments when awareness turned inward, that his heart would simply stop, that the machine would fail completely, that consciousness would cease not as sleep but as death, as the final consequence of having pushed biological systems beyond all sustainable limits. When the flood finally stopped, when the insights ceased arriving and exhaustion could no longer be denied, Newton did not sleep. Could not sleep, had lost the capacity entirely, had damaged whatever mechanisms allow consciousness to surrender, to release, to find the darkness where rest lives. Instead, he collapsed into something that was not sleep but resembled a twilight state where he remained partially aware but could not move, could not think clearly, could not do anything except lie still and wait for systems to partially restore themselves, for the crisis to pass, for consciousness to return to something approaching functionality. The collapse lasted days, perhaps a week. The chronology is uncertain because Newton himself could not later say with confidence how long he had been incapacitated, how long the recovery had required, how long consciousness had existed in that liminal state between waking and something darker, something that resembled death more than sleep, something that announced with perfect clarity that limits had been reached, that boundaries had been crossed, that further pushing would not yield further insights, but only final breakdown. Only the complete and irreversible failure of systems that had sustained impossible demands for impossible duration. Where memory fades into the gaps in Newton's documentation, into the missing pages and the periods where nothing was recorded, we can only infer what occurred during this crisis. Perhaps he experienced what we would now call psychotic break, the fragmentation of consciousness that occurs when stress and exhaustion and isolation combine to overwhelm the mind's capacity to maintain coherent perception, coherent thought, coherent sense of self. Perhaps he hallucinated. Perhaps he lost the ability to distinguish between what was real and what was generated internally. Perhaps he experienced the terror that comes when consciousness can no longer trust itself, when perception becomes unreliable, when the self that seemed so solid reveals itself as temporary construction that can dissolve under sufficient pressure, sufficient deprivation, sufficient violation of the requirements that keep it stable. Or perhaps he experienced enlightenment. Perhaps the breakdown was also breakthrough. Perhaps consciousness pushed beyond its normal boundaries does not just fragment but expands, does not just fail but transcends, does not just break but breaks through into territories where understanding becomes direct, where knowledge arrives not through reasoning but through immediate perception, where the unity underlying apparent diversity reveals itself not as theory but as lived experience, as the dissolution of boundaries between observer and observed, between self and cosmos. Between consciousness and the reality it normally perceives as separate. Both descriptions might be true. Both might describe the same event from different perspectives. Perhaps what we call psychotic break and what mystics call enlightenment are the same phenomenon, our consciousness operating beyond its normal constraints. And the only difference is interpretation, whether we view the experience as pathology to be treated or insight to be valued, whether we see breakdown or breakthrough, whether we recognize genius or madness in the state that Newton achieved through plague-year months of pushing consciousness past every reasonable limit. Some believe he never fully recovered from this crisis, that something broke during those days of continuous work and incomplete collapse that never quite reassembled properly, that left him permanently changed, permanently operating with slightly different rules than before, permanently marked by having touched territories that consciousness should not access, that are protected by the barriers of normal sleep and normal social interaction, and normal realitytisting that Newton had eliminated during the plague years. His later writings show evidence of this alteration, the paranoia that would characterize his relationships with colleagues, the difficulty trusting that others were not stealing his ideas, appropriating his insights, undermining his work. The sense that forces conspired against him, that the universe itself sometimes seemed hostile, that understanding came at a cost that included not just physical exhaustion but psychological vulnerability, the loss of whatever protective mechanisms normally shield consciousness from the recognition that we are fragile, that reality is less stable than we pretend, that the self we believe so solid can dissolve under the right or wrong conditions, leaving only the terror of consciousness untethered from the moorings that normally keep it sane. Marked by the crisis that occurred sometime during the second plague year, marked by the breakthrough that changed him in ways he could not fully articulate, marked by the realization that he had approached limits he should not have approached and survived, but barely, and survived changed, transformed, bearing scars invisible to others, but permanent nonetheless. Newton emerged from the crisis different. Not better or worse necessarily, but other. Operating by different principles. Seeing patterns others missed, but also seeing patterns that were not there, that were generated by consciousness damaged enough to create its own content when external content was insufficient, that had learned during the plague years to operate in states that normal consciousness avoids, and that, having learned, could not entirely unlearn, could not return completely to normal functioning. Did the crisis produce his greatest insights, or did it destroy his capacity for normal social existence? Perhaps both. Perhaps the same event that allowed him to see unity underlying diversity also made it impossible for him to trust colleagues, to collaborate normally, to participate in academic life without constant suspicion that others sought to undermine him. Perhaps the consciousness that could perceive mathematical patterns invisible to others had been damaged in ways that made it perceive threats equally invisible, equally real to Newton, equally demanding of response even when no objective evidence supported the perception. This is the terrible ambiguity at the heart of the plague years. That the practices which produced genius also produced damage, that breakthrough and breakdown occurred simultaneously, that Newton achieved extraordinary understanding and lost ordinary functionality through the same processes, the same sleepless months, the same refusal of rest that opened doors to insight and also doors to territories where consciousness should not venture, where sanity becomes questionable, where genius and madness share the same address and cannot be distinguished except by outcome, except by whether the visions prove productive or destructive, whether the patterns perceived correspond to reality or are purely internal generation, whether the unity discovered is genuine feature of the universe or artifact of consciousness, pushed so far beyond normal functioning that it begins creating its own unity, its own patterns, its own reality when external reality proves insufficient to satisfy the hunger for understanding that has become indistinguishable from the hunger itself. From the need that can never be satisfied because satisfying it would require stopping, and stopping has become impossible, has become the one thing consciousness cannot do after plague years of never stopping, of always continuing, of pushing past every limit until limits themselves dissolved. And what remained was consciousness operating in territories where breakdown and breakthrough are one thing, where catastrophe and revelation speak the same language. Where Newton stood alone at the center of his crisis, wondering whether he had discovered the universe's deepest secrets, or whether he had simply lost his mind entirely, and discovering that the question had no answer, that perhaps both were true, that perhaps the secrets could only be discovered by consciousness willing to risk losing itself, that perhaps understanding of this depth required precisely this sacrifice, this willingness to approach the edge and peer over and risk falling, risk breaking. Risk the complete dissolution of the self in pursuit of truth that seemed worth any price until the bill came due, and the price revealed itself as everything, as sanity itself, as the capacity to distinguish between genius and madness that Newton lost during the plague years and never entirely recovered, never entirely regained, carrying forward for the rest of his life the marks of the crisis that was also revelation, the breakdown that was also breakthrough. The moment when consciousness exceeded its design specifications and achieved insights impossible for normal awareness, but at a cost that included the normalcy itself, the capacity for ordinary human functioning that Newton sacrificed without quite meaning to, without quite recognizing until too late that some boundaries exist for good reason, that some limits protect rather than constrain, that some territories of consciousness are forbidden not because they contain no truth, but because the truth they contain destroys the capacity to bear it, to integrate it, to remain sane while possessing it, leaving only the choice Newton faced. Abandon the pursuit or continue knowing that continuation means risking everything, means approaching the crisis, means crossing lines that cannot be uncrossed and learning truths that cannot be unlearned, and becoming something that cannot go back to being what it was, can only go forward changed, marked, permanently bearing the cost of the breakdown that looked like breakthrough and perhaps was both, was revelation and catastrophe simultaneously. Was the moment when Newton achieved his deepest insights and lost his deepest stability, proving that sometimes the price of understanding is understanding itself, is the capacity to trust one's own mind, is the confidence that what consciousness perceives corresponds to reality rather than being purely internal generation, proving that genius, when pushed far enough, becomes indistinguishable from its opposite, that breakthrough, when taken to extremes, becomes breakdown. That the plague years' greatest achievement was also their greatest destruction, leaving Newton with insights that changed civilization and with damage that would never heal, both arising from the same source, both products of the same practices, both testimony to what happens when consciousness refuses rest, refuses limits, refuses to acknowledge that some boundaries should not be crossed, some territories should not be explored. Some understandings should not be pursued because pursuing them requires becoming something that can pursue them, and what we become in the pursuit can never quite become human again, can never quite return to the ordinary world with ordinary concerns, can only carry forward the extraordinary understanding and the extraordinary damage, both permanent, both the legacy of the moment when breakdown looked like breakthrough and perhaps was, when catastrophe appeared as revelation and perhaps was. When Newton stood at the center of his crisis and saw either the universe's deepest truths or the complete unraveling of his own sanity, and could not tell the difference, and perhaps there was no difference. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps this is what genius requires and what genius costs, and what Newton paid during the plague years, when the breakdown that looked like breakthrough taught him everything about the universe and nothing about how to live in it anymore, how to trust his own perceptions, how to distinguish between the insights that illuminate and the delusions that destroy, how to know whether the crisis had elevated him or ruined him or somehow, impossibly, done both at once. In 1667, the plague subsided enough that Cambridge reopened its gates, called its scholars home, resumed the rhythms of academic life that had been suspended for 2 years. The roads that had been empty filled again with travelers. The villages that had been silent heard voices once more. The world, diminished by death but persistent in life, continued its ancient patterns day following night, season following season, the cycles that humanity had honored since before anyone learned to count the dead, since before plague had name, since consciousness first recognized that some rhythms are not chosen but discovered, not imposed but acknowledged as fundamental to existence itself. Newton returned. But what returned was not quite what had departed. It is said that, when he arrived at Cambridge, carrying notebooks filled with mathematical innovations that would reshape physics for centuries, carrying also the marks of isolation that no notebook could record, his colleagues knew immediately that something had changed. Not in what he said. Newton had never been talkative, had always been reserved, had arrived at Cambridge initially as a quiet student among many, but in how he was, in the quality of his presence. In something about his eyes, or his bearing, or the sense he gave of existing slightly apart, slightly removed, slightly displaced from the shared reality that others inhabited as naturally as breathing. The young student who had departed Cambridge in 1665 was unremarkable, promising perhaps, but not exceptional, one scholar among many pursuing understanding through the traditional methods of study and discussion and the communal life of the university. But the man who returned carried in his person the evidence of something that had occurred in isolation, something that could not be fully explained or understood or integrated into the social world that welcomed him back, that made space for him physically, but could not quite make space for what he had become, for the consciousness that had operated for 2 years in complete solitude and had forgotten or never learned how to operate any other way. Beneath the surface of resumed academic life, beneath the lectures and discussions and the routines that Newton tried to rejoin, lived a fundamental disconnection. The world had continued during the plague years. Others had lived through the isolation too, had survived in their own shelters, had emerged when safety returned, and had resumed their lives with the natural resilience that characterizes human adaptation, the ability to return to normal patterns after disruption, to reintegrate into social existence after forced withdrawal. But Newton had not just survived the plague years, had used them, had transformed isolation into productivity of such intensity that his consciousness had been reshaped, had been carved into new forms by the demands he had placed upon it, had been fundamentally altered in ways that 2 years of normal life could not have accomplished, but that 2 years of extreme abnormality had made permanent, irreversible, the foundation upon which all future experience would be built. Where memory fades into the accounts of those who knew him, into the fragmentary testimony of colleagues who tried to understand what had happened to the quiet student during his absence, we find descriptions that suggest profound unease. Newton worked at strange hours, would be absent from meals and from college events, would be found in his rooms at dawn, still dressed as he had been the previous evening, suggesting he had not slept, or had slept so briefly that undressing seemed unnecessary, that the boundary between day's work and night's rest had dissolved so completely that maintaining it seemed artificial, seemed like an imposition that his consciousness could no longer accommodate. He spoke of his plague year work in terms that troubled his listeners. Not because the mathematics was wrong, the calculations were brilliant, revolutionary, undeniably correct, but because of how he described their origin. They had come to him, he said, had appeared complete in his mind. As though he had discovered rather than invented them, as though the insights were gifts from unknown sources rather than achievements of his own intellect, as though the sleepless vigil had opened doors to understanding that normal consciousness could not access, that required precisely the violation of normal patterns that he had practiced during the isolation. Some believe he was trying to explain without revealing, trying to communicate the experience of those plague years without admitting how extreme his practices had been, how completely he had abandoned normal human rhythms, how far he had pushed consciousness beyond sustainable limits. Because to admit would be to acknowledge that the methods were unsustainable, that they could not be recommended to others, that they had produced genius at a cost that should not be paid, and Newton perhaps could not bear to acknowledge this, could not face the possibility that his greatest achievements had been purchased through practices that had damaged him permanently, that had made him into someone who could no longer quite function in normal social existence. The temporal displacement persisted. This is what the evidence suggests most clearly. Newton could not resynchronize with the world's cycles. The plague years had taught his consciousness to operate outside time, to work through nights and days without distinction, to measure duration by completed work rather than by the sun's movement. And this pattern, established across 2 years of complete isolation, could not simply be abandoned when external circumstances changed, when society expected him to attend lectures at scheduled times, to take meals when others did, to participate in the communal life that makes universities more than collections of individuals, that transforms separate scholars into communities of understanding. But Newton remained separate, attended events irregularly, arrived late or left early or failed to appear at all, not from rudeness, but from genuine inability to calibrate his activities to external schedules, to remember that others expected his presence at particular times, to understand that synchronization was not just convenience, but courtesy, not just efficiency, but the social glue that binds individuals into functioning groups. His colleagues tried to accommodate, tried to understand, tried to make space for brilliance that operated by different rules, that produced insights so valuable they justified the strangeness, the irregularity, the sense that Newton existed in their midst but not quite with them, present physically, but somehow absent in ways that made normal collegiality impossible, normal collaboration difficult, normal friendship perhaps unreachable. Marked by the years that followed his return, marked by the decades of productivity at Cambridge that would cement his reputation as among the greatest minds in human history, marked also by the persistent strangeness that would characterize his entire life, Newton demonstrated what happens when consciousness shaped by extreme isolation tries to reintegrate into social existence. The reintegration was partial, incomplete. He could perform his academic duties, could write papers and conduct experiments and eventually teach students, but he could not quite belong, could not quite rejoin the temporal flow that others inhabited, could not quite recover the natural synchronization that makes human life sustainable, that allows us to exist together in shared time, that prevents the isolation he had experienced during the plague years from becoming the isolation that would characterize the rest of his life. Some believe the plague years broke something in Newton that could never quite be repaired, not his intellect, which remained formidable, but his capacity for normal human connection, for the easy synchronization with others' rhythms that makes social existence natural rather than effortful, automatic rather than conscious, something we do without thinking rather than something we must constantly work at maintaining. And work Newton did. Worked at appearing normal. Worked at attending to social obligations. Worked at participating in university life, despite the fundamental mismatch between his internal rhythms and the external expectations. Worked so hard at maintaining the appearance of normalcy that the work itself became exhausting, became another task to accomplish alongside the mathematical and experimental work, became burden that those who had spent plague years differently did not carry, did not understand, could not quite recognize as burden because to them synchronization was natural, was effortless, was not work at all but simply how consciousness operated when it had not been damaged by isolation, by sleeplessness, by the plague years' practices that had carved new patterns too deep to erase. Did he regret returning? Did some part of Newton wish he could retreat again to Woolsthorpe, to the manor where he had worked in complete isolation, where synchronization with others was unnecessary because others did not exist, where time could be personal rather than shared, where consciousness could operate according to its own damaged rhythms without the constant friction of trying to match rhythms it could no longer quite follow? The notebooks suggest ambivalence, pride in the work accomplished during the plague years, satisfaction with the insights achieved. But also, in private moments recorded in fragmentary notes, hints of recognition that something had been lost, that the isolation had cost him capacities he only noticed were missing when he tried to use them, when normal social interaction proved unexpectedly difficult, when the simple act of being present with others at scheduled times required levels of effort that others seemed not to need, that others accomplished without apparent thought or strain. Perhaps this is the deepest cost of the plague years, not the physical damage, not the trembling hands or racing pulse or blurred vision, but the social damage, the permanent displacement from the shared temporal existence that makes human life bearable. That allows us to coordinate, to collaborate, to exist together in ways that Newton, after 2 years of complete isolation, could never quite fully resume, could never quite entirely achieve, leaving him stranded between worlds. Between the isolation where he had achieved so much and the social existence that he could observe but never quite fully rejoin, never quite entirely inhabit. The world had continued during the plague years. This was perhaps the most difficult truth for Newton to accept. That while he had worked in isolation, others had lived, had loved, had formed connections and maintained rhythms and participated in the ongoing flow of human existence that did not pause for plague, did not stop for isolation, did not wait for anyone no matter how brilliant, no matter how productive, no matter how valuable their insights. The world continued. And when Newton returned to it, he discovered that returning physically was not the same as returning fully, that presence was not the same as belonging, that 2 years of complete isolation had created a gap that could never quite be closed, a displacement that would persist for the remainder of his life. So he did what he had learned to do during the plague years. He worked, continued the patterns established in isolation, maintained the strange hours, the irregular sleep, the practices that had produced genius during the plague years, and that he now carried forward because they were all he knew, because changing would require becoming someone else, because the consciousness shaped by isolation could not simply reshape itself for social existence no matter how much that existence demanded it, no matter how clearly he recognized the cost. And the cost was visible to those who knew him. The loneliness that persisted despite being surrounded by colleagues, the sense that he existed behind glass, visible but unreachable, present but somehow absent. The strange quality of his interactions, like someone performing social behavior rather than naturally embodying it, like someone who had learned the rules but could not quite internalize them, could not quite make them automatic, could not quite achieve the easy flow that characterizes human connection when it operates naturally, unconsciously, without the constant effort that Newton's every social interaction seemed to require. Perhaps there was no other way. Perhaps consciousness that had achieved what Newton achieved could not also maintain normal social functioning. Perhaps the depth of his understanding required the displacement from ordinary human existence. Perhaps genius of this magnitude simply cannot coexist with normal belonging, normal synchronization, normal participation in the shared temporal flow that makes social life sustainable for those who are not Newton, who have not seen what he saw, who have not sacrificed what he sacrificed, who have not learned through plague years of isolation that understanding comes at a price, and the price includes the very thing that makes human existence bearable. Connection to others, synchronization with shared rhythms, belonging to something larger than the isolated self. Newton returned to a world that had continued, but he could not quite continue with it. Could only exist alongside it, parallel to it, observing it through the displacement that the plague years had created, and that would persist until his death, until the final moment when the isolation that began at Woolsthorpe was completed, when consciousness that had operated for decades slightly apart finally separated completely, when the return that had never been complete ended in the departure that was total, that allowed Newton to finally stop trying to synchronize, to finally cease the exhausting work of attempting to belong to a world whose rhythms he could observe but never quite follow, whose time he could measure but never quite inhabit, whose continuity he could witness but never quite join, leaving him forever marked by the plague years when the world stopped, but he continued, when isolation was enforced but he embraced it, when everyone else waited for return, but he used the waiting for work that would make return impossible. That would create permanent displacement. That would mean spending the rest of his life trying to return to a world that had continued without him, and that he could rejoin physically but never quite temporally, never quite fully, never quite in the way that others took for granted, leaving only the question that has no answer. Was it worth it? Were the insights worth the permanent isolation? Was the understanding worth never quite belonging again? Newton could not say, could only work. Could only continue the patterns established during plague years when continuation seemed necessary, and that afterwards seemed inevitable, seemed like the only thing consciousness knew how to do, the only mode it could operate in, the only relationship it could have with time and with others, and with the world that had continued without him, and that he returned to but could never quite rejoin, carrying always the mark of the plague years, the cost of the isolation. The permanent displacement from the shared existence that makes human life something other than continuous work, something other than isolated consciousness pursuing understanding at the expense of everything else, something other than what Newton became. Brilliant, yes, but also alone, always alone, returning to a world that had continued but unable to quite continue with it, unable to synchronize, unable to belong, unable to do anything except work and work and work until work itself became the only relationship, the only connection, the only thing that remained constant across the decades that followed the plague years when isolation was enforced, and afterward when isolation was simply who he had become. What the plague years had made him, what returning could not undo, what belonging could not repair, what all his understanding could not explain or fix or make bearable except through more understanding, more work, more isolation embraced not as choice, but as the only option remaining for consciousness that had discovered during the plague years that the world continues without us, and we can return to it, but we cannot make it stop, cannot make it wait, cannot synchronize with what continued during our absence, can only exist alongside it, observing, understanding, achieving insights that justify everything except the loneliness, except the permanent displacement, except the cost of returning to a world that had continued and discovering that continuation means we cannot simply resume, cannot simply pick up where we left off, can only go forward changed, marked, carrying the plague years with us always. Returning to the world, but never quite returning to belonging, to connection, to the shared existence that others inhabit so naturally while we watch from outside, brilliant perhaps, but also separate, always separate, marked forever by the time when the world continued, and we did not, when isolation was circumstance and then became condition, when return was possible physically but never quite fully, never quite completely. Never quite in the way that makes human life sustainable across decades, leaving only the work, the understanding, the insights that explain everything except why returning feels like remaining exiled, why presence feels like absence, Why Newton could come back to Cambridge, but could never quite come back to the temporal flow he had abandoned, the rhythms he had violated, the belonging he had sacrificed during plague years that gave him everything except the capacity to enjoy it, to share it, to exist with others in the way that makes achievements meaningful. That makes understanding something other than isolated consciousness, knowing things that no one else quite grasps, explaining things that no one else quite follows, living in time that moves differently from everyone else's time, returning to a world that had continued, but continuing in ways that world could not quite accommodate, could not quite understand, could not quite make space for except by allowing Newton to remain separate, remain other. Remain forever marked by the plague years when the world stopped, and he did not. When isolation created genius and destroyed belonging. When understanding came at the cost of everything that makes understanding bearable, leaving only the permanent return that was never quite complete, the rejoining that never quite succeeded, the homecoming that felt like exile, proving that some departures cannot be reversed, some isolations cannot be undone. Some plague years mark us forever, no matter how long we live afterward, no matter how much the world continues, no matter how hard we try to return to what we were before the isolation taught us that consciousness can operate alone and afterward, can never quite operate any other way, can never quite rejoin, can never quite belong, can only return to a world that continued and discover that continuing is not the same as welcoming back. That the world makes space for our presence, but not for our strangeness, not for our displacement, not for the permanent cost of the time when we were absent and the world was present, and the gap that opened then will never quite close, will mark us always, will be the inheritance of the plague years that Newton carried through decades of nominal return, of physical presence, of work that continued brilliantly while belonging remained forever just beyond reach, forever impossible to quite achieve. Forever the cost of those years when isolation was total and afterward could never be quite overcome, leaving Newton returned but not rejoined, present but not belonging, back in the world but never quite back in its time, its rhythms, its shared existence, carrying always the plague year's mark, the isolation's cost, the permanent displacement of consciousness that had operated too long alone and could never quite learn to operate any other way. For the remaining 60 years of his life, Newton never fully recovered the capacity for normal sleep. The pattern established during the plague year's brief rest of 2 or 3 hours, wakefulness through most of the night, work that consumed time without regard for the sun's position or society's expectations became permanent. Not choice by then, but consequence. Not practice, but pathology. The sleeplessness that had seemed like tool during the plague years, like method that served the work, revealed itself as damage that served nothing. That was simply the mark of consciousness broken beyond repair, beyond recovery, beyond any hope of returning to the rhythms that the plague years had violated so completely that even 6 decades later, even in old age when exhaustion should have finally made rest possible, sleep would not come as it should, would not restore as it must. Would remain forever fragmented, insufficient, the nightly reminder of costs paid during 2 years that marked all the years that followed. It is said that his colleagues at Cambridge, then later at the Royal Society, then finally at the Mint, where he spent his final years, all spoke of his peculiar hours, the lights in his rooms burning through the night, the sense that he inhabited a different temporal reality than those around him. They would arrive for morning meetings to find him still dressed, as he had been the previous day, still working at problems he had been pursuing when they left the evening before, still operating in the continuous present that characterized consciousness, unable to surrender, unable to release, unable to find the nightly dissolution that makes waking life sustainable. His productivity remained legendary even as his health deteriorated. The Principia was written largely during periods of intense, sustained work that others marveled at weeks, where Newton seemed to do nothing but write and calculate, eating irregularly, sleeping barely, pushing himself with the same intensity that had characterized the plague years, but now in service of codifying rather than discovering, of explaining to others what he had learned during isolation, of translating private understanding into public knowledge. But those who knew him noted the cost. The tremor in his hands that never quite disappeared, that grew more pronounced as years accumulated. The wild quality in his eyes that suggested someone perpetually on the edge of exhaustion, someone whose consciousness operated at the very limit of sustainability. The increasing paranoia that developed as the decades progressed, the difficulty trusting colleagues, the sense that others sought to undermine him, to steal his ideas, to appropriate discoveries that were rightfully his. Some believe the paranoia was simply personality, simply the natural suspicion of someone who had achieved much and feared losing credit for achievements. But perhaps it was something else. Perhaps it was a symptom of consciousness that never fully rested, that never achieved the deep sleep where the brain performs its essential maintenance, where emotional regulation is restored, where the capacity to distinguish between genuine threat and imagined danger is recalibrated. Perhaps the paranoia was what happens when consciousness operates for decades on insufficient rest, when the systems that normally modulate emotion and assess reality accurately are chronically depleted, chronically unable to function properly, because they never receive the nightly restoration that makes their continued function possible. Beneath the surface of Newton's later achievements, and they were considerable, were enough to secure his reputation even if the plague years had never occurred, lived a man struggling with basic human functions that others accomplished without thought. Sleep, rest, the simple act of closing eyes and allowing consciousness to cease for 8 hours. These had become impossible for Newton, had been impossible since the plague years, remained impossible until death finally provided what voluntary rest could not. Where memory fades into the medical accounts that are fragmentary at best, we find descriptions of Newton in old age that trouble even across centuries. Complaints of racing thoughts that would not quiet. Descriptions of lying in bed for hours without sleeping, without even approaching sleep, consciousness maintaining its vigilance against his will, refusing surrender even when exhaustion made waking misery, even when he desperately wanted rest, but could not achieve it because the capacity for rest had been eroded beyond recovery during the plague years. He tried remedies, sought medical advice, tried herbs and potions and all the primitive interventions that 17th century medicine could offer for disorders it could not understand, could not diagnose, could not treat except through superstition and hope. Nothing worked, or nothing worked for long. The occasional night of adequate sleep, achieved through exhaustion so complete that consciousness finally surrendered, would be followed by weeks of fragmented rest, of tour periods that left him more exhausted than before, of waking every 90 minutes as though some internal alarm refused to allow deeper sleep, refused to permit the restoration he needed. Marked by the decades that separated him from the plague years, marked by the accumulated exhaustion that no amount of work could justify, marked by the recognition that he would never recover what had been lost during that period of isolation, Newton lived with sleep disorder that modern medicine might diagnose as chronic insomnia, as circadian rhythm disruption, as the result of having violated biological imperatives so thoroughly that the systems governing sleep had been permanently damaged, had lost their capacity to function normally, had become unable to do what they were designed to do. Shut down consciousness periodically, allow the nightly death and resurrection that makes continued life bearable. Some nights, particularly in his final years, when age should have brought rest if nothing else could, Newton would pace his rooms until dawn, unable even to lie down, unable to pretend rest was possible, acknowledging through his movements what he could not acknowledge in words. That the plague years had taken from him something irreplaceable, that the patterns established through 2 years of extreme sleeplessness had become patterns that would persist for 60 years more, that would follow him to the grave, that would mark every night of his life as testimony to the cost of those early achievements, the price of understanding purchased through practices that destroyed the capacity for the very rest that might have made the understanding bearable. His writings from the later years show evidence of exhaustion that had become baseline, that was so constant he barely mentioned it except in private moments, in letters to friends where he admitted difficulties sleeping, where he described the racing thoughts and the inability to quiet his mind, and the sense that consciousness had forgotten how to stop, had been running for so long that stopping seemed impossible, seemed like something other people did, but that was no longer available to him. No longer part of his repertoire, no longer one of the possibilities that consciousness could access no matter how desperately it needed to. Did he connect this insomnia to the plague years? Did he recognize that the patterns established during isolation had persisted, had become permanent features of his existence? The evidence suggests he did, at least sometimes, in moments of clarity that pierced through the exhaustion and allowed recognition that what had seemed like productive intensity during the plague years had actually been damage, had been the slow destruction of systems that required rest to function, that could not be sustained indefinitely no matter how strong the will, no matter how important the work. But recognition did not lead to recovery, could not lead to recovery. Because the damage was done, was too deep, was written into the very architecture of his consciousness in ways that no amount of insight could repair, no amount of will could overcome, no amount of desperate desire for rest could undo. He would live to 84, would accomplish more in those 84 years than most humans accomplish in multiple lifetimes, would reshape physics and mathematics and optics and humanity's understanding of the cosmos, would be celebrated and honored and recognized as among the greatest minds in history, but he would never sleep well again. Would carry through all those years and all those achievements the mark of the plague years when he had learned to work without rest and had never learned to rest again, when he had demonstrated that consciousness can be pushed past normal limits, but had also demonstrated that consciousness pushed past limits does not return to normal, does not recover, does not regain what was sacrificed, can only carry forward through decades the cost of those early years. The price of understanding that was purchased with sleep itself, with the capacity for rest that makes long life sustainable rather than merely endured. The sleep he would never recover became the ghost that haunted his later years, the absence that shaped his presence, the loss that characterized his achievements even as the achievements accumulated, proving that, yes, consciousness can operate on insufficient rest for decades, can function, can produce, can accomplish extraordinary things, but at a cost that includes the very rest that would make the accomplishments enjoyable. That would make success feel like success rather than simply the continuation of work that cannot stop, that will not stop, that has forgotten how to stop, because stopping requires sleep and sleep requires capacity for sleep, and that capacity was destroyed during the plague years, and will never return, will never be recovered, will never be anything except the permanent absence that Newton carried through 60 years of nominal success, of genuine achievement, of productivity that amazed others, but that he experienced as simply continuation, as the only thing consciousness knew how to do, as the replacement for rest that had become unreachable, unsustainable, impossible, leaving him to work through nights. He could not sleep in days, he could not rest in years that accumulated into decades and decades that stretched into lifetime, marked always by the absence of sleep, by the loss of rest, by the plague year's permanent cost that no achievement could compensate for. No understanding could justify, no genius could make worthwhile because the cost was simply too high, the price simply too complete, the damage simply too permanent, the sleep he would never recover, the rest he would never regain, the nights he would never again experience as others did, as he once had before the plague years taught him to work without sleeping, and left him working without sleep until the final work was finished, until life itself ended. Until consciousness ceased not as nightly practice but as final fact, bringing at last the sleep that had been denied for decades, the rest that had been impossible since the plague years, the darkness that claimed him not as respite but as conclusion, as the end of all waking and working, and the vigilance that had persisted 60 years too long, proving that some sleep comes only at the end, some rest arrives only with death, some recovery is impossible no matter how desperately needed. No matter how long we live, no matter how much we achieve, leaving only the question that Newton carried to his grave. Was any of it worth the sleep I lost, the rest I sacrificed, the nights I spent awake while others slept and recovered and woke refreshed, while I continued until continuation became the only thing I knew, the only thing I could do, the only response to the plague years that had taken from me what I would never recover, what I would miss every night of the 60 years that followed. What I would finally find only in death, when the sleep I could never achieve in life arrived as the sleep from which there is no waking, no continuing, no work remaining, only the rest I needed all along, but could not accept while consciousness remained, could not achieve while life persisted, could not find except in the final darkness where sleep and death are one thing, where rest is permanent, where recovery is no longer necessary because there is nothing left to recover, nothing left to restore. Nothing left except the silence where even Newton's restless consciousness finally, mercifully, sleeps. In the end, what did Newton discover during those plague years? Calculus, yes. The mathematics that would unlock centuries of scientific progress, that would allow humanity to calculate motion and change and the trajectories of planets and projectiles, that would become the language through which physics speaks about reality. Optics, certainly. The understanding that white light is composite, that color emerges from separation, that the universe reveals its secrets to consciousness willing to work in darkness absolute, in isolation complete, in conditions that most humans would flee but that Newton embraced. Gravity, undeniably. The recognition that the same force pulls apples earthward and holds moons in orbit, that the cosmos operates by unified principles, that mathematics describes not just human constructions, but the deep structure of reality itself. These discoveries transformed civilization, reshaped human understanding, opened territories of knowledge that remain productive centuries later. But perhaps he also discovered something darker, something he could never quite articulate, but that shaped the rest of his life, that lived in the background of every calculation and every experiment and every interaction with the world that had continued while he worked in isolation. Perhaps he discovered that consciousness has depths accessible only through violation of its normal cycles, that certain insights arrive only to minds pushed past their limits, that understanding the universe's deepest patterns might require sacrificing the patterns that keep us human, that keep us sane, that keep us connected to the shared existence that makes knowledge worth pursuing in the first place. He spent 2 years refusing sleep, refusing day, refusing every rhythm, except the ones his obsession imposed. And he emerged changed, brilliant, yes, but also damaged, carrying truths about mathematics and motion, but also carrying something else, some knowledge about what consciousness becomes when it will not rest, when it pushes into territories that should remain unexplored, when it values understanding above survival, above sanity, above the simple human capacity to wake each morning refreshed rather than depleted. Ready rather than already exhausted by the prospect of another day pursuing knowledge that seems infinitely important until you achieve it and discover that achievement changes nothing about the fundamental loneliness, the fundamental disconnection, the fundamental cost of having spent plague years alone while the world continued without you. Beneath the silence of his later years, beneath the achievements and the honors and the reputation that made him legendary, lived a question that Newton perhaps never fully answered. Was it worth it? Could any insight, any innovation, any contribution to human knowledge possibly justify the price of never knowing silence again inside his own skull, of carrying thunder through every waking moment, which was nearly every moment of living in temporal displacement, that made normal human connection difficult, of sacrificing sleep not for 2 years, but for the remainder of his life, of demonstrating through his own existence that genius and suffering are not opposites, but partners. Not separate phenomena, but two aspects of the same choice, the same practices, the same violation of boundaries that should not be crossed. Some believe the plague years made Newton. That without that isolation, without those months of extreme focus, without the elimination of all distraction and all social obligation and all external rhythm, the insights would never have come. That genius requires precisely this kind of extremity, this violation of normal human patterns, this willingness to sacrifice everything to the pursuit of understanding. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps Newton's achievements could only have emerged from consciousness willing to pay the price he paid, willing to violate the boundaries he violated, willing to discover through terrible experience what happens when we refuse the oldest rhythms, when we insist on working while others sleep, when we believe that understanding justifies any cost and learn too late or perhaps learn, but cannot admit that some costs are simply too high. But others look at the same evidence and see something different. See a young man damaged by circumstances beyond his control, responding to isolation and fear, and the collapse of the world he knew by throwing himself into work so completely that work became pathology, became the thing that saved him momentarily and destroyed him permanently, became the practice that produced genius at the cost of the capacity for ordinary human happiness, ordinary human rest. Ordinary human existence in time that flows naturally rather than time that has been fractured by practices that should never be sustained as long as Newton sustained them. Where truth lives between these interpretations, we may never know. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps Newton's plague years represent both the heights of human achievement and a cautionary tale about the cost of such achievement. Perhaps what he discovered about the external universe, about motion and light and gravity, and the mathematical principles underlying all physical reality, is inseparable from what he discovered about the internal universe, about consciousness and its limits and its capacities, and the price it pays when pushed beyond those limits, when maintained in vigilance that should be temporary but becomes permanent, when subjected to practices that should be occasional but become constant. Perhaps the greatest secret he uncovered during those plague years was not about calculus or optics or gravity, but about the human condition itself. That we are fragile, that consciousness depends on rhythms we cannot violate without consequence, that understanding comes at costs we cannot always calculate in advance, that the pursuit of truth can consume the pursuer, that genius and madness share territory that cannot be mapped, only traversed at great risk, only explored by those willing to sacrifice not just comfort but capacity, not just ease but essence, not just time but the very structure of time, the cycles that give it meaning. The rest that makes continued waking possible. It is said that in his final years, Newton spoke occasionally of the plague years with something that might have been regret, or might have been simply exhaustion so profound that even memory of those productive months felt heavy, felt like burden rather than achievement, felt like the origin point of suffering that had never ended, that had merely changed form, that had persisted through 6 decades disguised as success, disguised as genius, disguised as the inevitable cost of understanding, when actually it was simply damage, simply the result of having violated requirements that consciousness has, that biological existence has, that human life has and cannot function without, no matter how strong the will, no matter how important the questions, no matter how valuable the insights that emerge from the violation. Marked by the distance of centuries, marked by the accumulation of everything we have learned since Newton's time about sleep and consciousness, and the requirements of biological systems, marked by understanding he could not have possessed, we can see what he perhaps could not. That the plague years were both triumph and tragedy, both revelation and destruction, both the source of his genius and the origin of his suffering, both the period that made him legendary and the period that destroyed his capacity to enjoy the legend, to rest in the achievements, to find peace and understanding that he had pursued so relentlessly, and that, once achieved, could not provide what he needed because what he needed was not more understanding but more rest, not more insight but more sleep. Not more knowledge, but recovery of the capacity for unknowing, for surrender, for the nightly darkness where all questions cease and consciousness finds respite not in answers, but in the blessed absence of questioning. Perhaps it was never meant to be found, that perfect understanding Newton sought. Perhaps the universe keeps some secrets not because they are unknowable, but because knowing them requires becoming unknowable yourself, requires sacrificing the ordinary humanity that makes knowledge meaningful, requires paying prices that transform understanding into burden, achievement into curse, genius into the strange form of suffering that Newton embodied, celebrated and lonely, successful and exhausted, legendary, and marked by damage that no legend could compensate for. No achievement could justify, no understanding could make worthwhile. The darkness holds all secrets. This is what the plague years taught. But the darkness holds them for a reason, not to keep us from knowing, but to protect us from the costs of knowing, from the prices that must be paid to penetrate mysteries that perhaps should remain mysterious, that perhaps keep themselves hidden not from malice, but from mercy, from recognition that consciousness has limits, and those limits exist for good reason, that boundaries are not obstacles to transcend, but wisdom to honor. That the darkness which seems to hide secrets is actually the darkness that protects us from secrets too dangerous to bear, too costly to possess, too demanding of sacrifice that includes the very capacity to appreciate what has been gained. Newton entered that darkness during the plague years. Entered it voluntarily, enthusiastically, believing it was simply method, simply the elimination of distraction that would allow focus, allow intensity, allow the pursuit of understanding without interference. He did not recognize, could not have recognized that the darkness was also danger, that isolation was also damage, that the practices which seemed to serve the work were actually consuming the worker, were slowly destroying the capacity for rest that would have made the work sustainable, that would have allowed genius to emerge without requiring the sacrifice of everything that makes genius worth achieving. And so he worked in darkness, slept barely, emerged with insights that changed civilization, but also with damage that would never heal. Returned to a world that had continued without him, and discovered he could never quite continue with it. Carried through 6 decades the marks of 2 years, the costs of practices sustained too long, the permanent displacement from rhythms he had violated and could never quite recover. This is the final secret that the darkness holds, that some prices, once paid, can never be refunded, that some damage, once done, marks us forever. That the plague years which gave Newton calculus and optics and gravity also took from him sleep and rest, and the simple capacity to exist in time the way others do, leaving him stranded between what he had been before isolation and what he had become through isolation, something that could work brilliantly, but could not rest adequately, something that could understand the cosmos, but could not quite understand why understanding felt like burden rather than joy. Why achievement felt like exhaustion rather than satisfaction, why the secrets uncovered during plague years felt less like revelation and more like the knowledge of costs that can never be recovered, damage that can never be repaired, sleep that can never be regained no matter how many years pass, no matter how desperately it is needed, no matter how clear it becomes that the darkness which held the secrets also holds the price of knowing them, and the price is everything: rest, peace. The capacity for ordinary existence, the simple human ability to close one's eyes and sleep without the plague years intruding, without the memories surfacing, without the recognition that those 2 years changed everything and can never be undone, can never be recovered from, can only be carried forward as permanent mark, permanent cost, permanent testimony to what happens when consciousness refuses darkness during life and discovers that darkness deferred is darkness that arrives eventually anyway. Not as nightly respite, but as final cessation, not as rest, but as ending, not as sleep, but as death, which comes for Newton as it comes for all of us, bringing at last the darkness he had refused, the rest he had denied, the sleep that had been impossible since the plague years, and that arrives finally not as choice, but as conclusion, as the answer to the question that his life had posed. What happens to consciousness that will not rest? It works until it cannot work anymore. It continues until continuation becomes impossible. It pursues understanding until understanding reveals its final secret, that the darkness holds everything, claims everything, receives everything eventually, whether we surrender willingly or are overcome by forces too fundamental to resist forever. Newton resisted for 84 years. Resisted sleep, resisted rest, resisted the darkness that the plague years taught him to fear, and that his final years taught him to need, and that death finally provided when nothing else could, when will alone was insufficient, when consciousness itself could no longer maintain the vigil that had begun during plague years, and that persisted until life ended, until work ceased, until the questioning stopped not because it was answered, but because the questioner was gone. Had entered at last the darkness that holds all secrets, and that held Newton's secrets to what he discovered, what he paid, what he carried, what he could never quite explain to those who had not spent plague years alone, who had not violated sleep so thoroughly, who had not learned through terrible experience that some knowledge comes at costs that cannot be borne, that some understanding destroys the capacity to be comforted by understanding, that some secrets once known can never be unknown, but also can never quite be integrated, can never quite be reconciled with ordinary existence, can only be carried as burden until burden becomes too heavy and consciousness finally, mercifully, sets it down in the darkness that waits for all of us, patient and eternal, holding all secrets, requiring all rest, claiming all consciousness eventually regardless of what it achieved or failed to achieve, what it knew or failed to know. What it sacrificed or refused to sacrifice during the years when darkness was refused and work continued, and the plague years established patterns that would persist for decades, until persistence itself became impossible, and the darkness that holds all secrets finally received the one who had spent a lifetime trying to illuminate it, trying to understand it, trying to penetrate its mysteries without recognizing that the deepest mystery was why darkness exists at all, why rest is necessary, why sleep cannot be refused indefinitely without cost, why the plague years that seemed like opportunity were also warning about what happens when we believe we can transcend limitations that actually define us, that make us human, that must be honored, or we become something other than human, something that can work without rest, but also something that can never quite rest again, something that achieves genius but loses peace. Something that illuminates the cosmos while remaining itself in darkness that no amount of understanding can dispel, that no achievement can overcome, that persists until the final darkness arrives and proves what Newton learned too late. That the darkness which holds all secrets is also the darkness that holds all rest, all peace, all release from the vigilance that the plague years began, and that could only end when consciousness itself ended, when work ceased not because it was complete, but because the worker was exhausted beyond all recovery, beyond all restoration, beyond anything except the final rest where darkness no longer needs to be refused, because there is nothing left to refuse it with, nothing left to resist it with. Nothing left except surrender, acceptance, the recognition that the darkness was never enemy but friend, never prison but home, never the thing to be feared but the thing needed all along: rest, peace, the sleep that Newton refused during plague years and could never quite achieve afterward, and finally found in death when the darkness that holds all secrets opened to receive him, to grant him at last what life could not provide, what will could not achieve, what all his understanding could not earn. Sleep eternal and complete, the rest that comes when work finally ceases, when questions finally stop, when the vigil that began in a plague year manner finally, mercifully, ends. Good night, Isaac Newton. The vigil is over. The plague years have released you. And the darkness you feared, the darkness you refused, the darkness you could never quite accept during life holds you now gently, completely, offering at last what you needed all along. Rest in the silence where all secrets dissolve, all understanding becomes unnecessary, all genius finds the peace it could never achieve while waking. All consciousness discovers that the darkness which seemed to hide everything actually reveals the only truth that matters. That we are meant to rest, that sleep is not weakness but wisdom, that the cycles we violate return to claim us, and that the plague years which taught you to work without rest have finally ended in the rest without work, in the sleep without waking, in the darkness that holds all secrets, and that has claimed yours at last: what you discovered, what you sacrificed, what you achieved, and what you lost. All held now in silence that asks nothing, judges nothing, understands everything, forgives everything, and grants what life denied. Sleep, deep and dreamless, eternal and complete, the rest you earned through decades of exhaustion, the peace you purchased with a lifetime of vigilance, the darkness that is not ending but beginning, the beginning of rest that has no end, of sleep that requires no waking, of peace that knows no disturbance, where even Newton's restless consciousness finally, at long last, rests. The end: sleep well. The story is complete. And the darkness that holds all secrets holds you safely too, offering the rest that Newton could not find, the peace that eluded him, the sleep that you can accept as he could not. Close your eyes. Let consciousness dissolve, and find in the darkness not secrets but simply rest, which is, perhaps, the greatest secret of all.